The sun had barely risen over the Nile when the priest stepped into the sacred temple. His sandals barely made a sound as he crossed the threshold, and yet the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. His eyes met the statues of the gods, Osiris, Anubis, Hathor, silent, but powerful. This was a place of more than just worship. It was where the gods themselves were believed to walk, guiding and watching over the lives of all Egyptians. Their power was everywhere, a force that shaped everything from the very grain of sand beneath their feet to the infinite expanse of the sky above. It wasn't just belief, it was a deep, knowing certainty. The gods didn't merely exist, they controlled everything. They were the heartbeat of Egypt, and the people's lives, their very souls, were intertwined with them. Life, death, and rebirth, these were not just abstract ideas, they were the cycles that kept the world turning. At the center of this belief was Ma'at, the goddess of truth, balance, and order. Without her, everything would fall apart. The Egyptians understood this with a depth that ran through their veins like the Nile itself. To them, the world was in constant need of balance, like the heavy heart of a man being weighed against a single feather in the afterlife. Too much chaos, and the world would crumble. Too much order, and life would lose its pulse. Ma'at held everything together. She was not a distant ideal, but a living, breathing force. Every action in the lives of the Egyptians, from the smallest gesture to the grandest monument, was a testament to her. Every Egyptian had a relationship with the gods. It wasn't just for the kings, the priests, or the mighty. It was for every single soul who lived and breathed along the banks of the Nile. Even the farmers who worked the land were, in their hearts, dedicated to the gods. The pharaoh, god-king, was seen not just as a ruler, but as the intermediary between the gods and the people. It was said that he could speak to the gods and walk among them, his power so immense that it reflected in the very construction of Egypt's temples, pyramids, and tombs. The gods themselves were not cold, distant beings who sat on a throne in the heavens. No, they were intimately connected with the world around them, with the people's hopes, dreams, fears, and struggles. Take Osiris, for example. He wasn't just a god of the afterlife. He was a symbol of resurrection, of the power of nature, of the never-ending cycle of death and rebirth. His story was tragic yet hopeful. The god who was killed, his body dismembered, only to rise again stronger than ever. Osiris wasn't a god you feared, he was the god you looked to for comfort in times of despair. In a world where death was never far away, Osiris' resurrection offered the promise of eternal life. And then there was Anubis, the god of mummification, whose role was equally crucial. He was the one who ensured the dead were properly prepared for the afterlife. The mummification process wasn't just a ritual, it was a vital, sacred act. Without it, the soul could not live on in the afterlife. Anubis was the guide, the protector of the dead, ensuring that each soul had the chance to join the gods. His black jackal-headed form was a symbol of both death and protection, an eternal guardian who stood watch over those who had passed. But it wasn't just the major gods who mattered. The Egyptians believed in a world filled with spirits, beings that walked between the realms of the living and the dead. Every home had its own little gods, protective deities who guarded the family, the hearth, and the home. These weren't grand, majestic beings. They were small, humble, and often carried a sense of personal connection. The ancient Egyptians saw the divine in everything, every tree, every stone, every drop of water. The gods were in the whispers of the wind, the warmth of the sun, the ripples of the Nile. The temples were the heart of this divine connection, not just places of worship, but places where the gods lived and interacted with the people. The priests who served in these temples were not merely religious leaders. They were the gods' representatives on earth, the keepers of sacred knowledge, and the caretakers of divine power. They would perform rituals, offer sacrifices, and chant prayers to ensure that Ma'at remained intact, that the balance of the world was never lost. Behind all of this was the understanding that life was fragile. The gods held the power to shape and break it. A single misstep, a single act of dishonor, could undo everything. That's why every act, every word, and every thought was so heavily weighed. The Egyptians didn't just worship, they worked to live in harmony with the gods, to follow their guidance and live in accordance with their will. To do otherwise was to invite chaos into their lives, a chaos that could destroy not just them but the entire world. And the afterlife? It was a continuation of this eternal struggle between order and chaos, life and death. The soul would journey through the duat, the underworld, encountering dangers, tests, and divine beings. The deceased would need to prove their worth, to show that they had lived justly and upheld Ma'at. Only then could they reach the field of reeds, a place of peace, where they would join the gods in eternity. The Egyptians believed that death was not an end, but a new beginning, a rebirth into a new form, an eternal cycle of life, death, and resurrection. The gods were not just figures of myth. They were part of the very fabric of Egyptian existence. Their presence could be felt in the rhythms of everyday life, in the way the Nile flooded each year, in the way the sun rose and set, in the endless cycle of seasons. They were inescapable. To honor them, to live in accordance with their laws, was to secure one's place in the afterlife. And in the vast, silent darkness of the tomb, the Egyptians' hearts beat with the certainty that they would not be forgotten. Their spirits would live on. They would walk with the gods. The wind whispered through the open doorway of the tomb, as if the very walls were breathing in time with the heartbeat of the world. The air was thick with the scent of ancient incense, and the flickering light from a single oil lamp cast shadows that seemed to dance, to move with a purpose of their own. Beneath the floor, hidden deep within the dark recesses of the earth, the soul of a man stirred. His body, wrapped in linen and guarded by the gods, was still, but his soul, his essence, lived on. And in that moment, the true depth of his existence was revealed, for in ancient Egypt, death was never an end. It was simply another step. The Egyptians didn't see the soul as a singular, static thing. It was a vast, intricate web of forces that connected every part of a person's being, spiritual, physical, and emotional. In their eyes, the soul wasn't just a breath of life, but a collection of energies that persisted far beyond the grave. They knew that the body would die, but the soul would endure, carrying with it the essence of who they were, the very spark of existence. The Egyptians believed in three primary aspects of the soul: the Ka, the Ba, and the Ak. The Ka was the life force, the spirit that lived within every person from the moment of birth. It was not the body, nor the mind, but the very energy that made a person alive. It was what breathed life into the body, keeping it moving, thinking, feeling. The Ka was what made you you. And when a person died, the Ka did not simply fade away, it remained, just as powerful, just as real. The Egyptians believed that the Ka lingered near the body, an invisible, eternal presence. It needed sustenance to survive, and so food and drink were offered to it, ensuring that it was not forgotten, that it could continue to exist. But the Ka wasn't just a lifeless force, it was intimately connected to the body, like the very pulse of life itself. Without it, the body was nothing more than a shell. Then there was the Ba, the personality, the essence that made a person unique. If the Ka was the life force, the Ba was the spirit of the person, their thoughts, their desires, their feelings. It was said that the Ba could leave the body after death, but it would always return, seeking to reunite with the body, to be whole once again. The Ba was not bound to the physical world. It was free to travel the heavens, to walk the earth, to visit the living, to experience the world beyond death. It was the part of the soul that could communicate with the living, to give guidance, or to watch over the family and loved ones left behind. To the Egyptians, the Ba was the most personal aspect of the soul. It was the soul of the person, the spark that made them truly alive, even after they had died. But even more powerful than the Ka and the Ba was the Ak. The Ak was the perfected, immortal soul. It was the culmination of everything a person had been, the essence of their life and their actions, distilled into an eternal form. It was not something that could simply be attained. It had to be earned. The Ak was the divine spark, the soul that had been purified through the trials of life and death. Only those who had lived justly, according to the principles of Ma'at, could hope to achieve this exalted state. The Ak was the soul that could enter the afterlife, that could walk with the gods, that could be reborn into eternal peace. It was the soul that transcended death, moving beyond the limits of the physical world and becoming one with the divine. The journey to becoming an Ak was fraught with peril. It was a path that began at death, but it didn't end there. After death, the soul would travel through the Duat, the underworld, where it would face judgment, tests, and trials. The heart of the deceased would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance. If the heart was heavy with sin, if it was filled with lies, deceit, or cruelty, the soul would be cast into the abyss. But if the heart was light, pure, in harmony with the universe, then the soul would pass through the trials and emerge into the field of reeds, a place of eternal peace, where the soul would be united with the gods and live forever. It was here, in this eternal peace, that the soul could finally be free of the suffering of the world. The Egyptians believed that death was not the end, but rather the final act in a larger, eternal process. Death was simply the moment when the soul shed its earthly form and continued its journey toward immortality. The Ak was not just a state of being, it was the promise of eternal life, a life beyond death, where the soul would join the gods in a place of endless beauty, joy, and love. But it was not only the soul of the individual that mattered to the Egyptians. They believed that the souls of the ancestors could remain active, watching over their descendants, guiding them, protecting them. The dead were not gone, they were simply in another form, another plane of existence. The Egyptians honored their ancestors with offerings and prayers, ensuring that their spirits were cared for, that they could continue to watch over the living. The dead were not to be feared, but revered. They were the ones who held the wisdom of the past, the keys to understanding life and death. The relationship between life and death was a delicate balance. The Egyptians knew that without death, life would have no meaning. Death was not to be mourned as an end, but celebrated as a continuation. The soul would endure, and through that endurance, the world would be kept in balance. The Ka, the Ba, the Ak, these were not just spiritual concepts. They were the very foundation of Egyptian life. The gods had given the soul, and they would guide it through every trial and tribulation, through life and death and beyond. The soul was eternal, a constant force in the world, forever moving, forever changing, forever living. The mournful sound of the flute echoed through the streets, its notes carrying the weight of loss across the city. The Egyptians did not fear death as many do today. They saw it not as an end, but as a part of an eternal cycle. In their eyes, life was not the final act, it was merely the prelude. Death, though sorrowful, was a passage. It was a doorway, a momentary rest before the soul moved on to something greater. For the Egyptians, death wasn't the end of the person, it was simply the moment when the soul shed its earthly form. The idea of an afterlife was so ingrained in their beliefs that the living treated death with the utmost respect. It wasn't just a private affair, it was a communal experience, a shared transition. The soul wasn't only a reflection of the person who had passed, but also a living thread that connected the family, the community, and the gods themselves. The moment a person died, the heart-wrenching rituals began. The body was laid out in the family home, carefully prepared for the journey ahead. The priest would arrive, draped in the robes of his sacred office, and the family would gather, their faces marked with grief. Yet their mourning was not just sadness, it was also hope, for they knew the soul would not vanish into oblivion. It would continue, preserved and protected by the rituals of the living. The body was washed, anointed with oils, and wrapped in linen bandages, each fold a prayer, each stitch a shield for the journey ahead. For the Egyptians, the body was sacred. It was the vessel that carried the soul through life, and it was honored even in death. The embalming process was meticulous, an art perfected over centuries. Every organ was removed, preserved, and placed in jars to protect the soul from decay. The body was treated like royalty, for it was thought that the soul would return to it, seeking rest, seeking protection. The tomb, too, was prepared with great care. A place was set aside for offerings, for prayers, for sacrifices. It was not merely a burial site, it was a doorway, a place where the living and the dead could commune. The rituals surrounding death were designed to ensure that the soul would make its way safely through the afterlife. The journey was not a simple one. It was fraught with challenges, trials, and dangers. The soul would pass through the Duat, the underworld, where it would be tested and judged. To make the journey safely, the deceased needed protection, guidance, and strength. So, the tomb was filled with offerings, food, drink, and amulets to ward off evil spirits. The dead were not left alone to face the unknown, they were cared for, watched over by the living. One of the most powerful rituals performed at death was the opening of the mouth. This sacred ceremony was meant to allow the deceased to breathe, to speak, to eat, and to drink in the afterlife. The family gathered around as the priest would touch the mouth of the deceased with a ritual implement, reviving the senses of the departed. The body was not merely an object to be mourned, it was a vessel of continued existence. And the ritual allowed the spirit to continue its journey with every breath it would take in the world beyond. The tombs of the dead were filled with items to ensure the comfort and survival of the soul. The Egyptians believed that the afterlife was a reflection of earthly life, and so they provided for the deceased as they would for a living person. Food, drink, clothes, and even jewelry were left behind to accompany the soul on its journey. But it wasn't just material things that the Egyptians believed were needed for the dead. They knew that the soul would need spiritual protection, protection from dangers lurking in the underworld, protection from chaos and darkness. Amulets shaped like gods, like Anubis or Osiris, were placed in the tomb to ensure safe passage. Magic spells, written on the walls of the tomb or inscribed on papyrus, were meant to guide the soul, to protect it from the dangers of the Duat, and to offer comfort along the way. But it wasn't just the deceased who were cared for, the living too had a role to play. Mourning was not only for the family, but for the entire community. The Egyptians understood that death affected everyone. A family lost a member, but the community lost a part of itself. So, friends, relatives, and neighbors came together to perform the rituals, to mourn, and to celebrate the life of the departed. The Egyptians had a special understanding of the interconnectedness of life, death, and the spirit. They understood that the dead were never truly gone, they remained with the living, in spirit, in memory, and in the rituals that kept them alive in the hearts of their loved ones. During the funeral procession, the mourners would walk slowly through the streets, chanting prayers, carrying the body to its final resting place. The air would be heavy with incense, and the streets would echo with the sound of wailing, a mixture of sorrow and reverence. The procession would wind its way to the tomb, where the final rites were performed. The body would be lowered into the tomb, the family and priests offering one last prayer before sealing the entrance. The tomb was both a sanctuary and a symbol of eternity. In that final moment, the living and the dead were bound together, connected by the rituals, by the love, and by the hope that the soul would continue, would endure, would be reborn into the next life. As the tomb was sealed and the mourners departed, a strange calm would settle over the land. The dead were no longer of this world, but they were never truly gone. They had simply passed to the next stage of their existence, where they would live on forever, sustained by the care and love of those who had sent them on their journey. In the stillness that followed, one could almost hear the whispers of the dead, carried on the wind, reminding the living that death was not an end, but a continuation. The Egyptians had always known this, death was not to be feared. It was simply the next step, and the living, in their rituals, made sure that the soul was always ready to take it. The desert wind whispered through the towering pylons of an ancient temple, carrying with it the prayers of the living and the echoes of the dead. In the stillness of the sacred chambers, three presences loomed, eternal and unyielding. They were not merely gods. They were guardians, judges, and shepherds of the soul's eternal passage. Their power was felt in every ritual, every tear shed for the departed, and every silent hope for a peaceful afterlife. These were the gods of the unseen, Osiris, Anubis, and Maat. Osiris stood at the heart of it all. Once a living king, he had walked the earth, beloved by his people and devoted to justice. But betrayal had torn him from the land of the living. His brother Set, consumed by jealousy, had struck him down, dismembering his body and casting it into the waters. Yet Osiris did not fade. His wife, Isis, with a love that defied death itself, gathered his scattered pieces and brought him back to life with her magic. But his return was not to the world of the living. Osiris rose as something more, something greater. He became the Lord of the Dead, the eternal ruler of the underworld. To speak his name was to invoke a promise, that death was not the end, that life would bloom again, even after the darkest night. Osiris sat upon a throne in the Hall of Judgment, his green skin a symbol of rebirth, his white crown a testament to his unbroken kingship. He did not rule with cruelty or fear. His presence was calm, steady, and unwavering, like the Nile that gave life to Egypt. Before him, the souls of the dead stood, hearts trembling in their chests. For Osiris would decide their fate. But his judgment was not born of vengeance or wrath, it was born of balance, of justice, and of truth. It was here, in the shadow of Osiris's throne, that Anubis took his place. The jackal-headed god was the silent guide, the unseen protector who walked beside the dead as they stepped into the unknown. Anubis had always been there, at the edge of the desert where life met death, where the earth met the stars. His black fur gleamed in the faint light of the underworld, his golden eyes unwavering as he carried out his sacred duty. He was the one who weighed the hearts of the dead, measuring them against the feather of Maat. With steady hands, Anubis would place the heart on one side of the scales, the feather on the other. His gaze never wavered, though the souls before him often quaked in fear. For the heart could not lie. It bore the weight of every deed, every thought, every intention. If the heart was light, free from the burden of guilt and wrongdoing, the soul would pass on to the field of reeds, a paradise of endless beauty. But if the heart was heavy, weighed down by untruth and imbalance, it was cast into darkness, consumed by the monstrous Ammit. Anubis did not judge, he revealed. He did not punish, he uncovered the truth. His role was both terrifying and comforting, for he ensured that the scales were always fair. The dead could not bribe him, could not deceive him. In his presence, there was no pretense. Only truth. And above it all, unseen yet ever present, was Maat. She was not merely a goddess, she was the essence of balance, the soul of order, the heartbeat of creation itself. Without her, the universe would crumble into chaos. Maat was not bound by flesh or form, she was the feather on the scales, the breath in the wind, the rhythm in the stars. Every act of kindness, every word of honesty, every moment of harmony in life was an offering to Maat. She did not speak, yet her presence was felt in every corner of the underworld. The scales Anubis held were her gift, the throne Osiris sat upon was her foundation. The dead did not plead with her, for they knew that she could not be swayed. Maat was eternal, untouchable, and pure. Her feather, light as the breath of a newborn, carried the weight of universal truth. The bond between these three was unbreakable. Osiris ruled with wisdom, Anubis guided with loyalty, and Maat ensured that all things remained in harmony. Together, they shaped the fate of every soul, weaving a story of life, death, and eternity that spanned the ages. They were not merely figures of worship, they were the architects of the afterlife, the guardians of the unseen. In the quiet of the tombs, as the flickering light of oil lamps illuminated the painted walls, their images were everywhere. Osiris, with his green skin and crook and flail, a symbol of hope and renewal. Anubis, with his jackal's head, a protector in the shadows. And Maat, with her single feather, the embodiment of truth. The living called upon them, prayed to them, and trusted them with their most precious possession, their souls. The Egyptians did not fear these gods. They revered them, loved them, and sought to honor them in every aspect of life. For they knew that, in death, they would stand before them, not as strangers, but as souls seeking the truth of their own hearts. In the halls of the afterlife, where shadows danced and eternity awaited, these gods stood watch, eternal and unyielding, ensuring that every soul found its rightful place. The air in the Hall of Two Truths was heavy with silence, a silence that pressed down like the weight of eternity itself. A soul stood trembling before the golden scales, its heart still warm with the echoes of a life lived. Around the chamber, the gods watched with unblinking eyes. There was no escape, no second chances, no place to hide. Every deed, every thought, every secret whispered in the dark was about to be laid bare. The heart, that fragile, pulsing vessel of life, was brought forth. It was more than an organ, it was the truth of the soul. And it lived every joy, every sorrow, every act of kindness, and every sin. It throbbed faintly now, uncertain of its fate, as Anubis stepped forward. The jackal-headed god, with his quiet strength and piercing gaze, took the heart in his hands as though cradling the universe itself. His presence offered no comfort, only certainty. The scales gleamed, their golden plates polished to perfection. On one side lay Ma'at's feather, a single plume so light it seemed to float on air. But its weight was immeasurable, it carried the burden of truth, the foundation of all creation. Anubis placed the heart on the opposite plate, and the balance quivered, teetering between hope and despair. Time seemed to slow. The room grew colder, as though the breath of the gods themselves held still. Osiris, seated upon his throne of reeds, leaned forward, his emerald skin glinting faintly in the torchlight. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fathomless as the Nile at night. He did not speak, for judgment was not his to declare, it was the scales that would reveal the truth. The heart began to whisper. Not in words, but in the language of memories. Its rhythm told the story of a lifetime. There was a day when it beat wildly with love, a moment of unbridled joy when it seemed to soar above the earth. But there were also shadows, times when its pulse quickened with anger, when it ached with regret, when it grew heavy with deceit. Each beat of the heart was a confession, a prayer, and a plea. The gods listened, unmoving. The scales tipped slightly, then steadied. The feather glimmered softly, as if absorbing the weight of each memory. This was not a punishment, it was a reckoning. The soul had carried this heart through a lifetime, and now it had to face the truth of what it had carried. To the side, a shadow loomed. Ammit, the devourer of the dead, waited silently. Her crocodile jaws gleamed, her lion's body tense with anticipation. She was not cruel, though her presence sent shivers through even the bravest souls. She was simply inevitable. If the heart proved heavier than the feather, she would consume it, ending the soul's journey forever. The soul would not move on to paradise or torment, it would simply cease to exist, swallowed by the void. The scales tipped again, trembling under the weight of judgment. Anubis's golden eyes flicked toward the heart, his expression unreadable. There was no pleading with him, no bargaining. He was not the arbiter of justice, he was its servant. And in his hands, the truth could not be denied. The torchlight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The images of gods and symbols seemed to come alive, whispering stories of lives long past. Osiris sat back, his calm presence filling the chamber. He had once faced this judgment himself, his own heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at. He understood the terror, the anticipation, and the hope. The soul before him trembled, unseen tears coursing through its being. It thought of the life it had lived, of the times it had chosen truth over lies, kindness over cruelty, courage over fear. It thought of its failures, its moments of weakness, the scars it had left behind. And yet, it also thought of the times it had tried to make things right, to do good, to seek balance. Finally, the scales stilled. The silence grew even heavier, pressing into the marrow of the soul. Anubis's hand rested lightly on the scales as he steadied the balance. The feather glowed faintly, a light so pure it seemed to pierce the shadows in the chamber. The heart throbbed one last time, then stilled, its story told. If the heart was light, the soul would be led forward, its path clear to the field of reeds, a paradise where the Nile flowed endlessly, where the crops grew tall, and where the dead lived in peace for eternity. If the heart was heavy, Ammit would rise, her jaws opening wide to devour it whole. There was no plea that could save a soul from the weight of its own truth. The Hall of Two Truths stood timeless, a place where life and death met, where the soul's worth was measured not by its power, its wealth, or its name, but by the purity of its heart. The gods watched, their eternal gaze unflinching, as the scales revealed what the soul had always known, deep within. The body lay still, bathed in flickering lamplight. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a fragrant veil separating the living from the dead. Around it, mourners whispered prayers, their voices trembling with a mixture of grief and reverence. This was no ordinary farewell. The moment was sacred, the stakes eternal. The soul was waiting, lingering on the threshold of two worlds. Every movement, every chant, every gesture now held a profound weight. What came next would shape eternity. The priests stepped forward, their hands steady but their hearts solemn. They bore the tools of preparation, sacred implements passed down through countless generations. The body before them was not merely flesh, it was a vessel, a bridge between the mortal world and the vast unknown beyond. It deserved care, precision, and above all, respect. The ritual would ensure that the soul's path was clear, its defenses strong, and its heart ready for the trials to come. The first cut was not just an incision but a promise to preserve what could be preserved, to safeguard the body for its eternal voyage. The priest murmured words of power as he worked, his voice low and steady. These words were not for the living. They were for the Ka, the vital essence of the departed. The Ka would need sustenance, strength, and connection to the world it had left behind. Without it, the soul would falter. The heart, the seat of emotion and memory, was left untouched. It was too precious, too vital. It would be the soul's companion in the afterlife, its most trusted ally and its greatest test. The rest was carefully removed, treated, and stored. This was not a desecration but a preparation. To the Egyptians, the body was more than a shell. It was a sacred map, each organ a key to navigating the underworld. Natron, the divine salt of preservation, was applied to the body with deliberate care. Its crystalline touch was cold, final, yet oddly comforting. It whispered of eternity, of a body that would endure long after the stars had shifted. The priests worked tirelessly, their hands never faltering. They understood the gravity of their task. This was not just for the dead, it was for the balance of the cosmos, for the harmony of Ma'at. The wrappings came next, linen strips anointed with oils and resins. Each layer was a shield, a prayer, a piece of armor against the chaos that awaited in the underworld. The body, once fragile and exposed, was now a fortress, fortified against time and decay. The priests whispered more prayers, their words weaving into the fabric like threads of light. The wrappings encased not just the body but the hopes of the living, the love of family, and the eternal promise of rebirth. Amulets were placed with care, their placement as deliberate as the stars in the sky. The Ankh for life, the scarab for transformation, the Eye of Horus for protection, each one carried the weight of ages, its power forged in the fires of faith. The amulets would guide and guard the soul, their magic unyielding in the face of darkness. They were more than objects, they were companions, guardians, and beacons of hope. The Book of the Dead was prepared, its spells inscribed with painstaking precision. The words were ancient, their power undiminished by time. They spoke of gates and rivers, trials and truths, monsters and gods. The soul would face many challenges, but it would not face them unarmed. These spells were its weapons, its map, and its light in the shadowed corridors of the Duat. The face of the deceased was painted, not in deathly pallor but in vibrant life. The features were restored with careful strokes, a final act of love and remembrance. This was the face the soul would wear in the afterlife, the face it would show to Osiris, to Anubis, to Ma'at. It was a face of dignity, of grace, of readiness. When all was done, the priest stepped back. The room fell silent, the air heavy with incense and anticipation. The body, now a mummy, lay in its eternal stillness. But this was not the end. The soul was awake, stirring, preparing for the long road ahead. It would pass through gates of fire, rivers of chaos, and trials of truth. It would face its own heart, its own past, and the judgment of the gods. The coffin, a masterpiece of gold and lapis lazuli, was closed. Its surface gleamed with depictions of the sun's journey, of Ra's battles with the serpent Apep, of Osiris's resurrection. These were not mere decorations, they were reminders of the eternal cycle, of death and rebirth, of endings that were never truly final. The coffin was sealed, its lid a barrier and a promise. The procession began, mourners carrying the coffin with slow, deliberate steps. Their wails pierced the night, raw and unfiltered. They walked not just to bury the dead, but to send the soul on its way, to light its path with their love and their grief. The road to the tomb was sacred, each step a prayer, each tear an offering. At last, the tomb loomed, its entrance a mouth that swallowed the living and the dead alike. Inside, the walls were covered in scenes of paradise, a paradise not of clouds and harps, but of fields that stretched endlessly, of rivers teeming with life, of a sun that never set. The tomb was not a place of finality but a gateway, a threshold between the seen and the unseen. The coffin was laid to rest, surrounded by treasures, food, and offerings. The ka would need these to sustain itself, to remain strong and connected. The priests spoke their final words, their voices steady even as their hearts quivered. They knew what lay ahead. The soul would face trials that would test its very essence. It would stand before the gods, its heart laid bare, its truth revealed. The tomb was sealed, the weight of the stone heavy but not oppressive. It was a protection, a shelter, a sanctuary. Outside, the mourners wept, their cries echoing into the stillness. But within the tomb, a quiet strength stirred. The soul was ready. The path was set. The journey had begun. The room was dark, save for the dim glow of a single oil lamp. Its flickering light danced over ancient scrolls, the delicate hieroglyphs etched with such precision they seemed alive. These words were not written to be read casually. They held power, a sacred purpose. They whispered of gates that could not be passed without their permission, of words that could bind chaos and awaken gods. This was no ordinary writing. This was the map of eternity, a voice speaking to the silence of death. The priest's hands trembled slightly as he unrolled the papyrus. Not out of fear, but reverence. He knew the weight of what lay before him. Each word, each symbol, carried a piece of the soul it was meant to protect. This text was the lifeline of the deceased, their only guide through the twisting, perilous world of the do-it. Without it, the soul would wander lost, forever separated from the paradise it longed for. Every syllable was a lifeboat in an ocean of uncertainty. The pyramid texts were among the oldest of these sacred writings, inscribed directly onto the cold stone walls of the pharaoh's tombs. The words seemed to hum with an ancient energy, a spellbinding force that had weathered millennia. They spoke of ascension, of a king who would not be bound by death. They were not mere prayers, they were commands. Commands to the heavens, to the gods, to the very fabric of the universe itself. Rise, O king, they proclaimed, their voices echoing through the silent tomb. May you ascend to the sky among the imperishable stars. These texts did not beg for favor, they demanded it. They demanded that the deceased be seen, that they be acknowledged as one of the eternal, as a being worthy of the stars. The words carried the weight of authority, yet they were tender too. They promised protection, reassurance that even in the darkest hour, the soul would not be abandoned. Later, as the years passed, the coffin texts emerged. No longer reserved solely for royalty, these spells found their place on the wooden coffins of nobles and commoners alike. The hieroglyphs wound their way across the surfaces like ivy, wrapping the dead in a cocoon of words. Each spell was a lock and a key, a shield and a sword. They spoke of the soul's journey, of the challenges it would face and the tools it would need to overcome them. One spell whispered of transforming into a bird, wings spread wide to soar over danger. Another told of water that flowed like life itself, cool and sustaining in the scorching deserts of the underworld. And yet another described a serpent, coiled and hissing, but powerless in the face of the soul armed with these words. The texts didn't just offer guidance, they offered hope. Hope that the dead were never truly alone, that their voices could still be heard, that they could still fight for their place in eternity. Then came the Book of the Dead, a masterpiece of spiritual survival. Written on papyrus and placed with the deceased, it was not a single book but a collection of spells, tailored to the needs of the individual. The words were chosen carefully, each one an amulet of protection. The spells were not written for the living, they were whispered to the dead, a promise that they would be prepared for what lay ahead. One of the most haunting spells spoke of the soul's heart. It pleaded, "Do not betray me in the judgment hall of Ma'at." The heart, the keeper of all deeds, would be weighed against the feather of truth. If it was heavy with sin, the soul would face annihilation. But if it was light, if it had lived with integrity, the gates of paradise would open wide. The words were a reminder and a plea: live well, so that you may die well. The Book of the Dead didn't stop at warnings. It offered power, the kind that only words could grant. There were spells to summon protective gods, to calm the waters of the treacherous river, to defeat the beasts that lurked in the shadows. There was even a spell to control the winds, to ensure that the soul's boat sailed swiftly and safely to its destination. The words were not passive, they were alive, dynamic, ready to act on behalf of the soul that carried them. Each text, whether carved in stone, painted on a coffin, or written on fragile papyrus, was more than a guide. It was a testament to the love and devotion of the living. Families, priests, and scribes poured their hearts into these words, knowing that their efforts could make the difference between eternal joy and eternal despair. The ink, the tools, the hours spent copying every detail, all of it was an act of faith, a gift to the departed. And yet, these texts were not just about death. They were about life. They spoke of a life lived with courage, kindness, and wisdom. They reminded the soul of who they had been and who they could still become. They offered redemption, a chance to rise above mistakes, to find peace even in the face of judgment. As the final spell was written, the scribe would lift their brush, their hand steady despite the enormity of the task. The last hieroglyph completed the spell, the final thread in a tapestry that spanned the living and the dead. The scroll was rolled with care, its fragility a stark contrast to the power it held. It was placed beside the body, a silent companion on the loneliest of journeys. The tomb grew quiet once more. The air was still, the shadows long. But within the darkness, there was a spark of faith, of determination, of hope. The words were ready. They would carry the soul across rivers of chaos, through halls of judgment, and into fields of eternal peace. They would stand as guardians, as guides, as echoes of the love left behind. And in the stillness, the dead were never truly alone. The darkness pressed in like a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped rhythmically, each drop a reminder that time, even here, refused to stand still. This was not the silence of peace. It was a silence that pulsed with unseen dangers, a silence that whispered warnings to those brave, or foolish, enough to enter. This was the Do-It, the land where the dead walked a treacherous path, their fate balanced on the edge of every step. The air was thick, the kind of thick that weighed on your chest, making it hard to breathe. It smelled of earth, damp and ancient, but there was something else, too, something sharp and metallic, like the faint tang of blood. A river wound its way through the darkness, its waters black and restless, and yet it shimmered faintly as though it carried the souls of the departed in its currents. The river was both a path and a threat, leading the dead closer to their destiny but never without a price. In the Do-It, nothing was ever as it seemed. The river could suddenly rise, turning calm waters into violent rapids. Shadows moved where there should be none, and the faint glimmer of light might just as easily belong to a distant star as to the piercing eyes of a lurking creature. The dead could not trust their senses here. The Do-It was a place that fed on fear, twisting it into something solid, something alive. The first trial came quickly. It always did. A figure loomed in the distance, its shape obscured but its presence unmistakable. Its voice was low and guttural, the kind of sound that crawled under your skin and settled in your bones. It demanded an answer, not in words, but in truth. The soul standing before it had no choice but to confront itself, to offer up its intentions without deceit. Lies had no power here. In the Do-It, the truth was the only currency that mattered. Further on, the path narrowed, the edges crumbling into an abyss so deep that even sound feared to travel there. The soul walked carefully, their footsteps echoing faintly before being swallowed by the void. From the shadows came whispers, soft and insidious, each one laced with a memory of regret, a moment of shame. "You are not worthy," they hissed. "Turn back." But the dead had no choice. The only way out of the Do-It was through it. There were guardians here, monstrous beings with scales that glinted like shards of obsidian. Their teeth were jagged, their eyes burning with a hunger that could not be satisfied. They prowled the paths, waiting for the weak, for those whose courage faltered for even a second. But they were not mindless predators. They had a purpose, a duty to weed out those who were unworthy of the afterlife. For the dead who carried fear like a weight, these creatures were inescapable. For the brave, they were challenges to overcome. But courage alone was not enough in the do-it. The trials demanded more: wit, resourcefulness, the ability to see beyond what lay in front of you. A massive gate blocked the path, its surface covered in hieroglyphs that pulsed faintly, as though alive. The gatekeeper emerged, its form shifting between human and something far more ancient. It asked questions, riddles that seemed nonsensical at first but carried layers of meaning. Only those who could decode the truth behind the words would pass. Those who faltered would find the gate opening, not to paradise, but to something far darker. And yet, the do-it was not entirely without mercy. There were moments, brief and fleeting, where light broke through the oppressive darkness. A golden glow would appear, and with it, the faint outline of a boat. The boat was simple but sturdy, its surface inscribed with prayers of protection. The god Ra, his sun disk blazing like fire, guided the vessel through the treacherous waters. For those who earned his favor, the boat was a reprieve, a safe passage through the most dangerous parts of the underworld. But even Ra's light could not shield the soul from everything. There were waters infested with serpents, their eyes glinting with malice as they coiled and struck without warning. There were lakes of fire, their heat so intense it seemed to burn the very air. And then there was the Chaos Serpent, Apep, a being so vast and terrible that even Ra's light dimmed in its presence. Apep did not attack with fangs or claws, it attacked with despair, dragging the soul into a void of hopelessness. Only the strongest wills could resist its pull. And yet, for all its horrors, the do-it was not designed to punish. It was a crucible, a place where the dead were tested and refined. The trials were not meant to break them, but to reveal their truest selves. Strength alone could not conquer the do-it. Nor could cunning or wisdom. Only a heart unburdened by lies, regret, and malice could withstand the underworld's relentless challenges. The final challenge was not one of beasts or riddles, but of reflection. The soul stood before a pool, its surface still and black as polished obsidian. When the soul looked into the water, they did not see their reflection, they saw their life. Every choice, every action, every word spoken and unspoken. The pool showed everything, even the moments the soul had long tried to forget. It was not judgmental, it simply showed the truth. The weight of that truth was the soul's to carry, or release. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the path brightened. The oppressive weight of the do-it began to lift, and the air grew lighter, filled with a warmth that had not been felt since life itself. But the dead could not yet relax. Ahead was the Hall of Ma'at, where the final judgment awaited. The do-it had tested their resolve, their courage, their very essence. Now, it was time to see if they had passed. The do-it was not a place one escaped unscathed. It left its mark, carving away the illusions of life to reveal what lay beneath. Some souls emerged stronger, ready to face Ma'at's scales with a heart they could hold high. Others crumbled, their truth too heavy to bear. But one thing was certain, no soul left the do-it unchanged. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the shadows themselves held their breath. The soul stood trembling, surrounded by figures whose presence was overwhelming. They were not human, though some wore human faces. These were the divine judges and guardians of the underworld, beings who determined the soul's fate. Their gaze pierced through every pretense, their silence heavy with power. There was no escape from their scrutiny, no place to hide. The first figure stepped forward, tall and unyielding. It was Anubis, the jackal-headed god, his black fur shimmering faintly under an otherworldly light. He moved with quiet authority, his eyes glowing with a strange mix of kindness and severity. In one hand, he held a staff, and in the other, the scales of Ma'at. Anubis was not here to condemn, but to ensure fairness. He guided the soul to the scales, his presence steady and firm, as though his very being promised justice. But there was no comfort in that justice, for it would reveal everything, the good, the bad, and the forgotten. As Anubis prepared the scales, another presence made itself known. It was Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe. He stood to the side, silent but watchful, holding a reed pen and a scroll. Every movement of the soul was noted, every whisper of their heart recorded. Thoth's eyes seemed to see beyond time, as though he already knew the outcome. His presence was unnerving, his stillness a reminder that nothing escaped his records. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but resonant, echoing in the silence. He recited the soul's deeds, his words slicing through the air like a blade, leaving no room for denial. But the soul's trial did not end with the judges. Guardians stood between them and the afterlife, their forms both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Ammit waited near the scales, her massive form a combination of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. Her jaws hung open slightly, revealing rows of teeth that gleamed like ivory blades. Ammit was the devourer of the unworthy, her role as clear as it was final. If the heart on the scales was heavier than the feather of Ma'at, it was hers to consume. She did not speak, but her presence was a constant reminder that failure was not an option. Her breath, slow and steady, was the only sound in the room, a haunting rhythm that seemed to sync with the pounding of the soul's heart. And then there was Osiris, seated on a high throne, his skin the color of vibrant green, a symbol of life and renewal even in death. Osiris did not move much, but his presence filled the space, his calm gaze offering a strange mixture of hope and fear. He was not there to argue or to question. He was there to decide. Around him stood a council of 42 judges, each representing a different aspect of truth and law. Their faces were a blur, shifting between human and divine features, their collective voice a low hum that seemed to vibrate in the air. Together, they would listen to the soul's confessions, weighing every word, every intention, with a precision that was both breathtaking and unnerving. But the path through the underworld was not just about judgment. It was riddled with challenges, and the soul would encounter beings who were far less merciful. Serpents with glowing eyes slithered through the darkness, their hisses echoing like whispers of doubt. Great beasts with the heads of falcons and bodies of bulls blocked the way, their sheer size a testament to their power. They did not attack mindlessly but demanded proof of worth. The soul had to answer riddles, recite sacred spells, and summon every ounce of courage to move forward. Failure meant being trapped in the do it forever, a fate worse than destruction. And yet, not all encounters were hostile. Some figures offered guidance, their forms gentle but otherworldly. Ma'at herself sometimes appeared, her feathers shining with a soft golden light. She did not speak often, but her presence brought clarity, her gaze a quiet encouragement to stay true to oneself. Her feather, placed on the scales, was not just a measure of purity but a reminder of the delicate balance between chaos and order. The dead also encountered Ra, the sun god, in his nightly journey through the underworld. His boat was a beacon of hope, its light cutting through the oppressive darkness. Ra's guardians, strong and vigilant, fought off the chaos serpent Apep, who sought to drag the boat, and the soul, into eternal nothingness. Watching the battle unfold was both terrifying and inspiring, a stark reminder that even gods faced trials in this place. There were moments when the soul's strength faltered, when the weight of the underworld seemed too much to bear. It was then that the divine beings revealed their true purpose, not just as judges and guardians, but as reflections of the soul itself. Anubis, with his steady guidance, reminded the soul of the importance of integrity. Thoth, with his relentless recording, emphasized the value of truth. Even Ammit, with her fearsome presence, was a reminder that choices had consequences, that life was not to be taken lightly. The underworld was not a place of cruelty, but neither was it kind. It was a mirror, a crucible where the soul's essence was laid bare. The divine judges and guardians were not there to punish or reward. They were there to reveal. In their presence, the soul could no longer hide behind lies or excuses. They saw everything, even the things the soul wished to forget. And in seeing, they offered the soul a chance, not a chance to escape but a chance to become. The underworld was filled with voices, some gentle, some harsh, all unyielding. Each voice had a purpose, a role in the grand process of judgment and transformation. The soul could not silence them, could not avoid them. They had to face them, to listen, to answer. And as the voices faded, as the scales tipped, the soul realized that the most important voice of all was their own. The water was silent, but it wasn't calm. Beneath the inky surface, something stirred, a darkness that seemed alive, waiting for any misstep. The soul stood at the edge of the river, their heart pounding with a rhythm that matched the quiet ripple of the waves. The river of souls stretched endlessly before them, a black ribbon under a sky that neither day nor night claimed. This was no ordinary river. It whispered, it lured, it threatened, and it held secrets too heavy for the living to bear. The boat arrived without a sound. Small and fragile, it seemed almost too delicate to hold the weight of a soul. The boatman, faceless and cloaked, extended a hand, silent as the grave. The soul hesitated, glancing back at the land they had left behind. But there was no retreat, the river demanded courage. With trembling steps, they entered the vessel, and the boat pushed off, gliding into the unknown. The water wasn't just water. It shimmered strangely, shifting between clarity and darkness. Sometimes it reflected the soul's face, distorted and fragmented, like a cruel reminder of the life they'd left behind. At other times, the river seemed to murmur, soft voices rising from the depths. Were they warnings? Cries of despair? Or echoes of those who had come before? The soul didn't know, and perhaps it was better not to ask. The first ripples of unease began when the river narrowed, its once smooth surface breaking into jagged currents. Shapes began to form in the water, elongated shadows that moved with unnatural grace. Serpents with scales that shimmered like obsidian rose from the depths, their eyes glowing with cold hunger. They didn't attack immediately. Instead, they circled the boat, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the fear that hung in the air. The soul clutched the sides of the vessel, their breath shallow. The boatman gave no warning, no reassurance. He only continued forward, his oar cutting through the water in a steady rhythm. Then came the screams. They erupted suddenly, piercing and desperate, echoing across the river. Figures began to rise from the water, translucent and twisted, their faces frozen in agony. These were the lost souls, the ones who had failed, who now lingered in the river's grasp, neither alive nor fully gone. They reached for the boat, their hands clawing at the air, their voices begging for release. Their touch was icy, and their cries were unbearable. The soul flinched, pulling away, but the boat did not stop. The boatman's hand rested firmly on the oar, his silence more commanding than words. The river widened again, and for a moment, the chaos subsided. The soul allowed themselves a breath, but the relief was short-lived. The stillness was worse. The water became eerily calm, its surface like a black mirror. And then, out of the silence, came the sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. From the shadows, a colossal figure emerged. Its body was that of a beast, its head crowned with jagged horns, and its eyes burned like embers. It was a guardian of the river, a creature born of chaos and fury, tasked with testing the resolve of those who dared to cross. The beast lunged, its claws slicing through the air. The boat rocked violently, and the soul clung to its edge, terror gripping them. The creature's roar was deafening, its breath hot and foul. The boatman did not waver. With one swift motion, he raised his staff, a burst of light erupted, forcing the beast to recoil. It did not retreat completely but lingered in the shadows, its growls a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded them. As the boat moved on, the river seemed to fight back. The currents grew wild, pulling and pushing the vessel with relentless force. The soul's arms ached from holding on, their body trembling from the cold that seeped into their bones. They wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but the boatman remained as steady as ever. He did not speak, but his presence was unyielding, a silent command to endure. And then, as if to mock the soul's resolve, the river began to shift. It became clear, so clear that the soul could see what lay beneath. Faces stared up at them, faces of the past, of loved ones, of enemies, of strangers. They smiled, they cried, they screamed, their expressions a cruel reminder of every moment the soul had ever lived. The soul wanted to look away, but the river wouldn't allow it. The reflections wrapped around their thoughts, forcing them to confront memories they'd buried long ago. The laughter of a child. The tears of a friend. The anger of betrayal. The ache of loss. The water was alive with their life, pulling them into its depths, tempting them to let go. But the boat pressed on. Slowly, the chaos began to fade. The water, though still dark, became calm again. The serpents retreated, the lost souls sank back into the depths, and the guardian's growls faded into the distance. The air felt lighter, though the journey was far from over. The soul looked ahead, their body weary but their spirit unbroken. The river had tested them, stripped them bare, and forced them to face what they had tried to forget. It had shown them fear, regret, and pain, but it had also shown them strength. They had crossed the waters, not unscathed, but still standing, their heart beating with a quiet determination. The boatman gave no acknowledgement, no sign that the worst had passed. He simply continued, his oar cutting through the water with the same steady rhythm, guiding the soul toward whatever lay ahead. The river faded into the background, its whispers growing faint, its trials now a memory etched into the soul's very being. The night was alive with a terrible stillness. The stars above blinked faintly, as if they too feared the darkness creeping across the horizon. In the sacred bark of Ra, the sun god's celestial ship, every light burned brightly, but all who stood aboard knew what was coming. It came every night, slithering from the unseen depths of existence, a shadow that no torch could chase away. Apophis, the serpent of chaos, was near. There was no warning, only a sudden, suffocating pressure in the air. The waters of the Duat, once calm, began to churn violently as if recoiling from an unseen force. Then it emerged. Apophis, massive and coiled, its scales glinting like black obsidian, broke the surface with a roar that seemed to shake the very fabric of creation. Its eyes glowed with hatred, twin orbs of blazing fire that burned with the sole purpose of devouring light, order, and everything that dared to defy it. The serpent moved with a terrifying grace, its body undulating in waves that sent shock after shock through the cosmic waters. The sheer size of it was enough to make even the bravest gods falter. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed to hunger for the very essence of the sun. The serpent did not need words, its presence alone screamed its purpose. It was chaos incarnate, and it would not rest until everything was unmade. Ra stood at the helm of his bark, his form radiating with the golden light of the sun. But even his brilliance dimmed in the shadow of the beast. He did not flinch. This was his eternal fight, the nightly struggle that defined existence itself. In his hand, he gripped a spear, its tip glowing with divine power. Around him, his loyal defenders, gods and spirits of unimaginable strength, readied their weapons, their faces etched with both fear and determination. Apophis struck first. The serpent's massive body lunged forward, its jaws snapping inches from the bark. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through the water, causing the ship to lurch violently. Ra's spear flew from his hand, the point aimed directly at the beast's fiery eyes. It struck true, but Apophis did not cry out. Instead, it writhed in fury, its coils tightening around the ship like a noose. The defenders attacked, their weapons flashing with divine energy, but the serpent's hide was like iron, impervious to their blows. The battle was chaos itself, a swirling mass of light and shadow, of shouts and roars, of hope and despair. Apophis thrashed, its tail slamming against the bark, splintering its sides. The ship seemed to groan in pain, its light flickering dangerously. The serpent's eyes burned brighter, and it lunged again, its fangs aimed at Ra's heart. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The sun god raised his shield, the light from it blinding, and the serpent recoiled, hissing with rage. But Apophis was relentless. It was not merely a beast, it was an idea, a force, a primal truth of the universe. It could not be destroyed, not truly. Every night it returned, stronger, more determined, its hunger insatiable. And every night, Ra and his defenders faced it, knowing that failure was not an option. If the serpent won, if its coils crushed the bark and extinguished the sun, the world would fall into darkness, and order would crumble into chaos. The serpent's body began to glow with a sickly light, a pulsing energy that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. It lashed out again, its jaws closing around the edge of the bark. The defenders fought harder, their weapons striking in unison, but Apophis did not relent. Its strength was endless, fueled by the chaos it represented. Ra's light flickered, and for a moment, it seemed as if the serpent might win. But then, from the heart of the bark, a sound rose, a chant, low and steady, growing louder with each passing second. It was the voices of the protectors, of those who believed in the balance of the world. Their words wove together, forming a shield of sound and light that pushed against the serpent's shadow. Apophis writhed, its coils loosening as the chant grew stronger. Ra seized the moment, his hand glowing with renewed power. He thrust his spear once more, this time aiming not for the serpent's body, but for its very essence. The tip of the spear burned with the light of 1,000 suns as it struck the serpent squarely in its chest. Apophis let out a roar that seemed to shake the heavens, its body convulsing as the light spread through it like fire. For a moment, the serpent seemed to falter, its form flickering as if caught between existence and nothingness. But then it sank back into the waters, its body disappearing into the depths. The river grew calm once more, the light of the bark steadying, but all aboard knew the truth. Apophis was not gone. It never truly disappeared. It would return, as it always did, to challenge the sun and test the strength of order against chaos. The defenders lowered their weapons, their bodies wearied but their spirits unbroken. Ra stood at the helm, his light shining brightly once more. He did not speak, but his presence was enough. The battle was over, for now. The serpent had been pushed back, its hunger momentarily sated, but the fight would continue. It always did. Apophis was chaos, a force that could never be destroyed, only held at bay. And every night, the sun god and his defenders stood against it, not because they expected victory, but because they knew the fight itself was what kept the world in balance. Chaos and order, darkness and light, they could not exist without each other. And so, the battle raged on, eternal and unyielding, the heartbeat of the cosmos. The first step felt like waking from a long, dark dream. A soft, warm breeze kissed the face of the soul as they stepped onto a path lined with golden reeds swaying gently in rhythm with an unseen melody. The air carried a sweetness unlike anything they had ever known, a scent that spoke of eternal spring and endless peace. The soul paused, their heart, if such a thing could still beat, filling with wonder, a pure, untainted joy that made them forget every pain, every struggle, every sorrow of the life they left behind. Before them stretched fields of such beauty that words could hardly do them justice. Endless green grasses shimmered with golden light, and crystal-clear streams wove through the landscape, their waters singing soft, soothing tunes. The sky was neither day nor night, bathed in an eternal glow that radiated warmth and comfort. The light didn't merely touch the skin, it seeped into the very essence of the soul, erasing every trace of fear or sadness. The field of reeds wasn't just a place, it was a promise kept, a reward for a heart weighed and found worthy. It was the vision of every dream, the answer to every longing, the perfection that mortals could only glimpse in fleeting moments of earthly joy. Here, the soul felt whole, as if a part of them that had always been missing was finally restored. Laughter echoed in the distance, and the soul turned toward the sound. Others were here, too. Friends, family, loved ones long lost to the sands of time now stood together, their faces glowing with happiness. There was no aging, no sickness, no weariness. The bonds of love, once severed by death, were renewed in ways that defied understanding. These weren't mere memories brought back to life, they were real, as vivid and vibrant as they had ever been. And they welcomed the soul with open arms, their embrace more powerful than words could convey. The soul stepped forward, and the earth beneath their feet was soft and cool, as though it, too, welcomed their presence. They walked among fields of wheat and barley, each stalk tall and golden, bending with the promise of abundance. There was no hunger here, no need, only fulfillment. In the distance, workers tended the land, their faces serene, their movements unhurried. It was not labor, it was communion with the land, a sacred act of creation where every touch brought forth life. The streams sparkled under the light, their waters so clear that every pebble at the bottom seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. The soul knelt by one, cupping the water in their hands. It wasn't just water, it was life itself, pure and unending. The first sip sent warmth coursing through them, a feeling so complete it brought tears to their eyes. But these weren't tears of sorrow, they were of gratitude, of awe, of a peace so profound it felt almost too much to bear. Everywhere the soul looked, there were signs of care, of a love that had shaped this place into perfection. Trees stood tall and strong, their leaves whispering secrets in a language that felt familiar, though the soul couldn't understand the words. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, their petals stretching toward the eternal light. Birds with feathers of every hue imaginable flitted through the air, their songs blending harmoniously with the streams, the rustling reeds, and the quiet hum of the land itself. The soul's feet carried them to the heart of the fields, where a great table was laid out under the shade of a massive tree. The table stretched endlessly, covered with fruits that glistened like jewels, bread that seemed to glow with warmth, and wine that shimmered in golden goblets. Here, the worthy gathered, their faces alight with joy as they shared in the eternal feast. There was no greed, no jealousy, only unity, a celebration of life and its triumph over death. The soul hesitated, overwhelmed by the perfection of it all. They felt unworthy, unsure if they truly belonged. But a hand touched their shoulder, gentle and reassuring. They turned to see a familiar face, a loved one they thought they'd never see again. No words were spoken, but the look in their eyes said everything. "You are home." With trembling hands, the soul took a seat at the table. The first bite of fruit was unlike anything they had ever tasted, a burst of flavor so rich, so full of life, it brought an uncontrollable smile to their face. The laughter around them grew louder, a sound that lifted their spirit like nothing else could. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a communion, a sharing of the deepest, truest parts of existence. As the feast continued, the soul noticed something remarkable. The workers in the fields, the birds in the trees, the reeds swaying in the breeze, all seemed connected, as if they were part of a single, living being. The soul felt it too, a bond that tied them not just to the people around them, but to the very fabric of the field of reeds itself. They weren't just in this place, they were part of it, an inseparable thread in a tapestry of endless beauty and peace. Time had no meaning here. Days didn't begin or end, they simply were, each moment flowing into the next like the waters of the streams. There was no need to hurry, no fear of loss or change. The soul could linger by the streams, wander through the fields, or sit beneath the great tree for as long as they wished. Every choice was perfect, every moment complete. Occasionally, the soul would look to the horizon, where the golden fields stretched out endlessly, meeting the light in a gentle embrace. It was then that they realized the truth: the field of reeds was not a destination but a continuation. It wasn't an ending, but a beginning, an eternal now where every step, every breath, was filled with peace, love, and harmony. The soul's heart swelled with gratitude. They understood now that this place was more than a reward. It was a reminder of what life could be, of what it meant to live with a heart unburdened by fear, regret, or sorrow. Here, everything was whole, perfect, eternal. And as the soul took another step, they knew they were finally free. The room was silent, but it wasn't an ordinary silence. It was the kind that hummed with unspoken truths and carried the weight of countless lives. The soul stood at the center, trembling, not from cold but from the unbearable weight of knowing this moment would define everything. There was no escaping it, no turning back. Every heartbeat felt deafening in the stillness, as though the heart itself knew it was about to be judged. In the distance, the faint shimmer of a golden scale caught the light, standing tall and unyielding. It was not a scale of metal and craftsmanship, it was alive, glowing softly, as though imbued with the breath of eternity. One side bore a single feather, delicate and white, its edges almost translucent, as if it had been plucked from the wing of truth itself. The other side waited, empty yet heavy with expectation. The soul's heart, small, fragile, and trembling, was brought forth. It pulsed faintly, a soft glow emanating from it with every beat. It was neither flesh nor memory, but something far more intimate. Every thought, every choice, every moment of kindness or cruelty, whispered within its rhythm. It was a mirror to the soul's very essence, unflinching and unforgiving. Standing by the scale was the jackal-headed god, Anubis. His presence was both terrifying and reassuring. His black fur gleamed under the otherworldly light, his eyes piercing yet calm. In his hands, he carried the heart with a care so deliberate, so reverent, that it made the soul ache with a sense of both fear and gratitude. He turned to the scale, his movements deliberate, every gesture carrying the weight of an eternity of judgment. Without a word, he placed the heart on the empty side. The scale shuddered, groaning softly as though the weight of the heart was far more than it appeared. The feather remained still, its pristine light unwavering, as if unbothered by the burden it was about to meet. The soul watched, frozen, as the scale began its delicate dance. Up and down, back and forth, it moved with agonizing slowness, as if the entire universe held its breath. The silence was shattered by a voice, not loud, but commanding. Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe, stood nearby, his quill poised over a scroll that seemed to stretch into infinity. His voice carried the weight of impartiality, his words weaving through the air like strands of fate. Every deed, every thought, every truth. It is all here. The soul's mind raced, 1,000 memories flashing in vivid bursts. A hand extended to help a stranger. A harsh word spoken in anger. Laughter shared under a golden sun. Tears shed in solitude. Every act of love, every failure, every triumph, and every regret seemed to echo in the stillness. The scale continued its slow, deliberate motion, and the soul's chest tightened with every movement. Then came a sound, a low, guttural hiss that sent shivers down the soul's spine. From the shadows emerged Ammit, the devourer. She was part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus, a terrifying embodiment of finality. Her yellow eyes glowed with hunger, her teeth glinting as she prowled closer to the scale. She did not speak, but her presence screamed of destruction, of an end that was absolute. If the heart failed, she would consume it, and the soul would be lost forever, erased from existence. The soul's knees buckled, but they did not fall. This was the moment they had feared and hoped for in equal measure. A lifetime of choices was laid bare, stripped of excuses and pretense. The scale continued to tilt, its movements maddeningly slow, as though the universe wanted to savor every second of this reckoning. Anubis stood unmoving, his gaze fixed on the scale. He was neither cruel nor kind, his presence a quiet reminder that this was not a punishment but a truth. Thoth's quill scratched softly against the scroll, his calm demeanor unshaken. Ammit's low growl rumbled in the background, a reminder of what was at stake. The soul's mind returned to moments they wished they could erase. Words that should never have been spoken. Promises that had been broken. But then, like a flicker of light in the darkness, came the memory of a child's laughter. A small hand held tightly in their own. A sacrifice made for another's joy. The weight of these moments, both good and bad, pressed against the scale, and the feather quivered for the first time. The soul's breath caught as the scale began to settle. The trembling slowed, and the needle steadied. The heart and the feather hung in perfect balance for a moment that felt like eternity. Every ounce of the soul's existence was suspended in that single, fragile instant. And then, the scale tipped. Anubis tilted his head, his eyes flickering with something that could almost be called kindness. Thoth's quill paused, and he looked up, his expression unreadable but not unkind. Ammit's growl faded, and she slumped back into the shadows, her hunger unsatisfied. The feather glowed softly, its light enveloping the heart with a warmth that brought tears to the soul's eyes. The weight lifted from the soul's chest, replaced by something indescribable. Not relief, not joy, but a peace so profound it seemed to dissolve every fear, every doubt. Anubis stepped back, his role fulfilled, and Thoth's quill scratched one final note onto the scroll. The scale stood still, its purpose complete, as the soul's heart was returned to them, lighter than it had ever been. The room seemed to exhale, the tension that had gripped it dissipating like mist under the morning sun. The souls stood taller, their form glowing faintly, as if the feather's light had left a permanent mark on them. They turned to Anubis, to Thoth, to the silent scale, and though no words were spoken, the gratitude in their heart was clear. As the soul stepped away, they felt the weight of their past lift, leaving only the lessons it had taught. The heart that had once been heavy with life's burdens now pulsed with a steady, serene rhythm. They walked forward, leaving the scale behind, knowing that they had been seen, measured, and found worthy. The chamber was vast and overwhelming, filled with a silence that demanded reverence. In the middle stood the soul, trembling not from cold but from the weight of what lay ahead. Before them loomed the 42 judges, each seated with an expression that bore no hint of mercy, no sign of bias. Their forms were magnificent and otherworldly, some human, others animal-headed, their presence both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Each represented a force of nature, a fragment of divine order, watching with unyielding intensity. The soul's chest tightened as their name was called. This was the moment that every being dreaded, yet hoped for. A life lived was now being laid bare, not in fragments or shadows, but in stark, undeniable truth. There would be no lies here, no clever words to mask mistakes. The soul stepped forward, heart pounding, and felt the weight of the gods' eyes upon them. The scribe, Thoth, stood ready with his eternal quill, his scroll already unrolled, stretching into infinity. He did not glance up, his focus fixed on the task of recording the truth as it was spoken. His calmness offered no comfort, it was not indifference but a reflection of the impartiality of the task. Then the voice rang out. "Declare yourself." It was not a suggestion, not a request. It was a command that reverberated through every corner of the chamber, piercing the soul's very being. The soul took a deep, shuddering breath, their body trembling under the weight of memory. Slowly, they began. "I have not stolen." Their voice cracked at first, but the words spilled out nonetheless. "I have not taken food from the mouths of the hungry. I have not caused pain to another living being." Each confession was a thread, a stitch in the tapestry of a life lived, unraveling in the presence of the gods. The judges watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. Each confession seemed to echo in the vast space, reverberating as though the words themselves were being weighed and measured. The soul could feel their gaze, not cruel but unrelenting, as if they were staring into the very essence of their existence. "I have not lied to gain advantage. I have not polluted the rivers. I have not cursed the gods." The weight of the truth was suffocating. Each word uttered was not just a defense, but an exposure, a peeling back of layers that had been built up over a lifetime. The soul's voice wavered. What if they faltered? What if a confession was untrue, even in the smallest of ways? Would they see it? Would they know? A single drop of falsehood would be enough to unravel everything. The tension in the chamber was unbearable, as if the air itself had thickened. The soul clenched their fists, their knuckles white, as they pressed on. "I have not turned a blind eye to suffering. I have not betrayed those who trusted me. I have not cheated the scales of fairness." The words became harder with each passing second. Not because they were lies, but because the act of speaking them aloud felt like tearing open old wounds, exposing every hidden corner of their existence to the light. The faces of the judges remained unmoved, yet the soul could feel their judgment. It wasn't the kind of judgment born from anger or vengeance, it was something far deeper, something colder and sharper. It was truth itself, staring back at them, demanding answers. There was no place for excuses here, no room for self-pity or justification. Only the truth mattered. A single bead of sweat rolled down the soul's temple as they continued. "I have not abandoned my responsibilities. I have not taken what was not mine. I have not spoken words to harm another's reputation. I have not spread hatred." Their voice grew steadier, even as the words began to choke them. There was no hiding now. Each confession was like standing naked before a storm, vulnerable and exposed, yet finding the courage to remain. The judges shifted almost imperceptibly, their forms shimmering slightly as though reacting to the truth being spoken. One of them leaned forward, his falcon head tilting ever so slightly. It wasn't approval or disapproval, just observation. The soul's breath hitched. Did they sense hesitation? Did they feel the soul's fear? I have not ignored the plight of the weak. I have not taken from the earth without offering gratitude. I have not betrayed my kin. The soul's knees felt weak, but they stood firm, forcing the words out. It wasn't just a recitation, it was a reckoning. Each confession was a plea, not for mercy, but for recognition of what they had tried to be, of the moments where they had faltered, but also where they had risen above. As the confessions continued, the soul began to feel something shift within them. The weight of the words, the act of speaking them aloud, began to feel like an unburdening. It was painful, yes, but there was also a strange, quiet strength growing in the act. To stand here, to face oneself without flinching, it was terrifying but also freeing. I have not sown discord among friends. I have not withheld from those in need. I have not caused unnecessary harm to the innocent. The soul's voice, though still trembling, grew louder. There was something defiant in the way they spoke now. Not defiant against the judges, but against the fear that had once held them back. The chamber seemed to hum with a strange energy as the last of the confessions was spoken. The soul's chest heaved with the effort, their body trembling but unbroken. The judges remained silent, their gazes still fixed upon the soul. The weight of their judgment hung heavy in the air, but there was no longer fear. There was only truth. Thoth's quill scratched softly against the scroll, recording the final words. The soul could not see what was written, but they could feel it, the truth of their life etched into eternity. The scribe paused, his quill hovering for a moment before he placed it down. He looked up, his eyes meeting the soul's, and for the first time, there was something in his expression. Not a smile, not approval, but a quiet acknowledgement. The soul stood there, exhausted yet unbowed. Every part of them ached, but there was a strange peace in the stillness that followed. They had spoken their truth, laid bare their soul, and stood in the face of judgment. Whatever came next, they knew one thing: they had faced themselves, and they had not turned away. The silence in the duet was not empty, it was alive. It pulsed and shifted like a living thing, heavy with expectation and unseen eyes. The soul walked forward, every step echoing against the unseen walls of eternity. There was no turning back now. Each movement carried the weight of 1,000 lifetimes, and yet the air hummed with something unspoken. Something waited ahead. Something divine. Out of the shadows, a presence emerged. He was taller than any man, his black jackal head gleaming under an invisible light. Anubis. His eyes locked onto the soul, piercing and unblinking, not with cruelty but with an intensity that seemed to strip away all pretense. He stood still, his sleek form exuding power, his hands resting lightly on a golden staff. For a moment, the soul forgot how to breathe. "Do you know why you are here?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an unearthly weight, as though the question itself had been carved into existence long before the stars were born. The soul nodded, their throat too dry to answer. Anubis tilted his head, studying them as though he could see through every layer of their being. The soul felt exposed, like a fragile leaf trembling in the wind. But there was no malice in his gaze, only purpose. Anubis gestured, and the air seemed to part like a curtain. Without a word, he guided the soul forward, his presence both a comfort and a warning. The path ahead shimmered, the edges of the world bending and folding in ways that defied reason. The soul's steps faltered as the ground beneath them shifted, but Anubis did not stop. He walked with the steady confidence of one who had traveled this way countless times. And then, the hall opened into a space unlike anything the soul had ever seen. At the center sat Osiris, his form glowing faintly, as though he carried the essence of life itself within him. His skin was a deep, emerald green, his eyes calm but all-knowing. He sat on a throne that seemed to grow from the earth, its roots twisting into eternity. Flanking him were other gods, silent, powerful, eternal. Each carried their own aura, their own story, their own truth. Osiris did not speak at first. He simply looked at the soul, his gaze filled with the weight of judgment but also a quiet compassion. The soul's chest tightened, their heartbeat echoing like a drum in the stillness. It was impossible to meet his eyes for long, they held too much. The history of creation itself seemed to swim within them, and yet they were kind, as though he understood every triumph and every failure that had brought the soul to this moment. Finally, Osiris raised a hand, his movements slow and deliberate. "You stand before us, not as a body, but as truth," he said, his voice resonating like the deepest notes of a song. "There is no hiding here. Speak, and let us know who you are." The soul opened their mouth, but no words came. The gods watched silently, their forms unmoving but filled with a presence that seemed to fill the air with electricity. Beside Osiris, Isis stood tall, her eyes sharp yet tender, her presence like a shield against the chaos of the duet. She said nothing, but her gaze offered strength, a silent promise that the soul would not be alone. And then the soul felt it, a pull, a gentle nudge from within. Words began to form, halting and uncertain at first, but they came. They spoke of their life, their choices, their moments of doubt and courage. They spoke not to defend themselves, but simply to be known, to lay bare the essence of who they were. The gods listened, their faces unreadable but their attention absolute. Hathor's presence was warm and soft, like sunlight filtering through leaves. She leaned forward slightly, her cow-horn crown catching the light, as though she could sense the weight of the soul's pain and offered silent comfort. Thoth, with his ibis head and scroll in hand, recorded every word with a precision that felt timeless, his quill moving as though guided by the universe itself. And then there was Set, standing in the shadows. His presence was chaotic and raw, a storm waiting to break. His eyes flickered with an energy that made the soul's skin prickle. He didn't speak, but his gaze was unrelenting, as if daring the soul to falter. Yet, even in his wildness, there was something undeniable, an understanding of the struggles that defined existence. Chaos and order, both sides of the same coin. The soul's voice grew steadier as they spoke, their words flowing now like a river breaking free from a dam. The air seemed to shift, the gods leaning ever so slightly closer, their forms glowing faintly as they absorbed the truth of the life laid before them. The soul felt an ache in their chest, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the moment. To stand here, to be seen, truly seen, was both terrifying and liberating. Finally, Anubis stepped forward again, his jackal head gleaming in the soft light. In his hands, he carried the scales, their golden frame glinting as though it held the weight of the cosmos. Beside him was Ma'at, her feather of truth delicate yet unyielding. Her presence was serene, her gaze steady, as though she alone held the balance of all things. The soul's heart trembled as Anubis placed it on one side of the scales. It was not a physical heart, but something more, something that carried every joy, every sorrow, every choice they had ever made. Ma'at stepped forward, placing her feather on the other side. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, the entire chamber holding its breath. The scales tipped, wavered, and then stilled. The soul's chest heaved as they stared at the balance, unable to tear their eyes away. The gods remained silent, their gazes fixed on the scales as though the entire fabric of existence hinged on this single moment. And then, Osiris rose from his throne. His movements were slow, deliberate, each step carrying the weight of eternity. He stood before the soul, his green skin glowing faintly, and placed a hand on their shoulder. His touch was firm but gentle, and for the first time, the soul felt a sense of calm wash over them. "You have spoken. You have been seen," he said, his voice resonating with an authority that shook the very ground beneath them. "Your truth has been weighed, and the gods have borne witness." The soul's knees buckled, tears streaming down their face as the weight of everything fell away. For better or worse, they had faced the gods, stood in the presence of eternity, and spoken their truth. In that moment, there was nothing else. Just the soul, the gods, and the infinite stillness of the duet. The moment judgment is passed, the soul stands at the threshold of something vast and incomprehensible. The air feels lighter, as if the weight of mortal life has finally lifted. There is no sound, yet an unspoken harmony hums in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The soul hesitates, unsure of what lies ahead. But then, a soft warmth wraps around them, not the warmth of sunlight or fire, but something deeper, something that feels like being welcomed home after an endless storm. The path forward is illuminated, not by torches or stars, but by a light that seems to come from within. It's not harsh or blinding, it is tender, patient, and impossibly pure. Every step feels like shedding another layer of fear, sorrow, and doubt. The soul walks, and with each step, they begin to remember, not just their life, but the essence of what they truly are. They are no longer bound by the aches and struggles of a physical body. They are something eternal, something that existed long before and will exist long after. Figures begin to emerge from the shimmering expanse ahead. They are familiar, yet more radiant than the soul remembers. Loved ones, their faces free of pain and age, stand waiting with open arms. They do not speak, but their smiles carry the weight of 1,000 reassurances. The soul feels a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelms them. Love, pure and untainted, pours into them like water quenching a parched desert. It is not just the love of those they knew, but the love of something much greater, something infinite. The landscape shifts, becoming more vivid with every step. Colors the soul had never seen in life stretch across the horizon. Fields of golden reeds sway in a gentle breeze that carries the scent of blossoms that never fade. A river winds through the land, its waters shimmering with a light that seems alive. This is not a place of waiting or emptiness, it is a place of fullness, a place where every corner pulses with life. And yet, the soul realizes, this life is not the same as what they knew before. There are no clocks here, no boundaries, no endings. The concept of time fades, replaced by a sense of being that is unbroken and complete. Memories from their mortal existence float around them like fragments of a dream, but they no longer hold the sting of regret or loss. Everything that happened, every triumph, every failure, feels like pieces of a mosaic, each one necessary to create the masterpiece of their existence. The soul's thoughts shift to those they left behind. A longing stirs within them, but it is not painful. They understand now that the bonds of love are not severed by death. Instead, they stretch across the veil, unbroken and eternal. The soul feels connected to those they loved, as if they can hear their laughter, their whispers, their tears. The soul does not wish to return, but they know that one day, those they cherish will follow, and they will meet again in this place where separation is no more. As the soul moves deeper, they encounter others, not just loved ones, but countless souls, each glowing with their own unique light. Some are strangers, yet the soul feels no fear, no hesitation. Here, there is no division, no judgment, no need for words. The connection between them is immediate and profound, like threads of light weaving into a single, brilliant tapestry. The soul feels their essence expanding, touching others and being touched in return. It is a communion of spirits, a unity that words cannot capture. In the distance, a towering tree stands, its branches reaching out to eternity. It is ancient yet vibrantly alive, its roots sinking into the very fabric of existence. The soul approaches it, drawn by a force they cannot resist. Beneath its vast canopy, they feel something stirring within them, a spark, small at first, but growing brighter with each passing moment. This is not just a place of rest, it is a place of renewal. The soul begins to understand that life does not end here. It transforms, evolving into something beyond comprehension. From the tree, a gentle voice speaks, not with words, but with a feeling that resonates in every fiber of their being. It tells the soul of their purpose, their journey, and their infinite nature. It speaks of cycles and rebirth, of lessons learned and lessons yet to come. The soul feels no fear, no anxiety, only awe and acceptance. They are not bound to a single path, but are part of something vast and interconnected, something that stretches across worlds and lifetimes. The soul gazes at the horizon, where the light grows brighter, beckoning them forward. They feel a pull, a call to move beyond even this place of wonder. They know now that this is not the end, nor is it a beginning. It is simply a continuation, a step into something even greater. The soul takes one last look at the tree, at the faces of those they loved, at the beauty surrounding them. They carry it all with them, not as a burden, but as a treasure. And then, with a heart full of peace and a spirit free of all that once weighed it down, the soul steps forward. The wind carried the scent of familiar blossoms, their fragrance evoking memories long thought forgotten. The soul stood still, eyes wide with wonder, taking in a world that felt strangely like home but also untouched by pain or decay. It was not a distant paradise, it was a place where every grain of sand, every blade of grass, seemed to hum with the echoes of a life once lived. This was not some otherworldly creation, it was a reflection, as though life itself had been turned inside out, revealing its hidden beauty and meaning. The field stretched endlessly, vibrant and golden, with crops taller than the tallest men they'd known. Each plant swayed in perfect harmony with the breeze, untouched by drought, disease, or the heavy toil of mortal hands. It was the same field the soul remembered from childhood, its rows once uneven, its soil once cracked under the sun, but now it glowed with a richness and abundance that seemed almost alive. It was as though every effort, every moment spent sowing and tending the earth and life, had been amplified into this eternal harvest. The soul moved slowly, hesitant yet curious. Beneath their feet, the ground felt soft and forgiving, nothing like the hardness they'd endured in the past. In the distance, the sound of flowing water called out like a gentle whisper. It was a river, clearer and purer than anything the soul had ever seen, yet its bends and turns matched the streams they once knew so well. On its banks, trees stood proud, their branches heavy with fruit that shimmered in the sunlight. These were not ordinary trees, they seemed to glow, their roots deeply entwined with memories of laughter, love, and even pain. Every moment spent nurturing life in the physical world had left its mark here, shaping this eternal reflection. The soul began to notice more, familiar tools resting by the side of a well, polished and gleaming as if new. They were the same tools their hands had gripped tightly, calloused and worn from years of work. But here, there was no sign of weariness, no struggle etched into the handles. Instead, they stood as silent witnesses to a life of effort and resilience, transformed into symbols of pride and achievement. The soul touched them gently, feeling not the weight of labor but the warmth of purpose. As they walked further, a small house came into view. It was simple yet radiant, its walls gleaming as if they were built from sunlight itself. It looked just like the one they had built with their own hands, brick by brick, through years of sacrifice. The doors were open, and from within came the faint sound of voices, joyful, familiar, and filled with love. The soul hesitated, their breath catching in their chest, as the figures inside came into view. These were the faces they thought they would never see again, faces that had been lost to time and fate. Their loved ones rushed to greet them, their embrace warm and grounding, as though no time had passed at all. There were no words, only the overwhelming sensation of being whole again. The soul realized then that this place was not just a reward, it was a mirror, polished to reveal the essence of what had been built in life. Every act of kindness, every sacrifice, every moment of joy or pain had been woven into this reflection, creating a world that was both familiar and extraordinary. The bonds formed in life had not been severed by death, instead, they had flourished, taking root in this eternal existence. In the distance, a familiar village came into view, its streets alive with laughter and music. The soul walked toward it, their steps light and unburdened. The village was vibrant, each building shining with a life of its own. Neighbors waved and smiled, their faces glowing with the vitality they had once known in their prime. This was not a place of strangers or fleeting acquaintances. Every soul here was connected, their lives intertwined through shared memories and experiences. The marketplace buzzed with activity, yet there was no chaos, no urgency. The air was filled with the scent of fresh bread and spices, reminiscent of mornings spent preparing meals for loved ones. Every bite, every shared meal, had found its way here, transformed into a feast that never ended. The soul watched as children ran through the streets, their laughter echoing like music. These were not just any children, they were the generations that had been nurtured through love and guidance, now thriving in this eternal reflection. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting everything in hues of gold and amber, the soul paused by a garden. It was lush and vibrant, filled with flowers that seemed to glow from within. They knelt down, their fingers brushing against the petals, and felt the presence of every moment they had spent tending to life in the physical world. Every seed planted, every life nurtured, had taken root here, blossoming into something far greater than they could have imagined. In this place, there were no shadows of regret, no ghosts of missed opportunities. The afterlife did not judge or punish, it simply reflected. The life lived was not erased but transformed, its essence shining brighter and truer than ever before. The soul understood now that the world they had known was not separate from this one. The actions, the choices, the love and the struggles, all of it had shaped this reflection, making it unique and deeply personal. The wind stirred again, carrying with it the faint sound of a song, a melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a song of life, of continuity, of connection. The soul closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, and felt a profound sense of peace. This was not just a place to rest, it was a place to thrive, a place where the beauty and meaning of life continued to unfold endlessly. The air shimmered with an otherworldly glow, as though the boundaries between what was mortal and what was divine had begun to blur. The soul stood in a vast expanse, an endless horizon of light that pulsed and breathed as if alive. There was no fear here, only a sense of awe so overwhelming it felt like standing on the edge of creation itself. The silence was not empty but filled with a presence so profound it seemed to press gently against the soul, urging it forward. From the luminous depths, figures began to emerge, their forms radiant and yet familiar. They were the gods. Osiris, the eternal ruler, stood in quiet majesty, his green skin glowing like fertile earth. Anubis, the guardian of the thresholds, watched with a gaze both fierce and protective. Thoth, the scribe of truth, held his scroll as if recording every step of this sacred transformation. These beings were not distant idols, they carried the weight of eternity with grace and power, their very essence vibrating with the energy of the universe. The soul's journey had not been easy. Every trial, every moment of judgment, had felt like stripping away the layers of the self, peeling back fears, doubts, and failures to reveal the core of what truly mattered. Now, standing before the gods, the soul felt exposed yet unafraid, as though the light itself had cleansed away all that was unworthy. This was not a place for pretenses or masks. Only truth could remain here, and it shone brighter than the stars. Osiris stepped forward, his presence commanding yet gentle, like the steady flow of the Nile. His voice resonated like the hum of ancient waters, carrying wisdom that spanned countless lifetimes. He did not speak words of judgment. Instead, he acknowledged the soul's existence, its trials, its triumphs, and even its scars. In his eyes was an understanding that transcended the mortal plane. To stand in his gaze was to feel the vastness of eternity and know that the soul's life had contributed its unique thread to the grand tapestry of existence. Anubis, with his jackal head gleaming under the golden light, extended a hand, his gesture solemn and deliberate. The soul hesitated, not out of fear but out of reverence. Anubis had walked with them through the shadows of the Duat, his presence steadying during moments of doubt. Now, his touch was like fire and frost, a reminder of both the fragility and the strength that defined existence. As his hand rested on the soul's shoulder, it felt as though the weight of mortality dissolved, leaving only essence, pure, undiluted, and eternal. Thoth moved closer, his ibis head tilted as if listening to the silent whispers of the cosmos. He unrolled his scroll, its surface glowing with the inscriptions of countless lifetimes. The soul caught glimpses of its own story among the stars and symbols etched there. Every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every word spoken with love was recorded, shining brightly against the backdrop of time. Thoth's quill hovered for a moment before it began to write again, adding a final mark to the soul's narrative. It was not an end, but a transformation, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The gods did not speak of ascension in grand declarations. There was no dramatic pronouncement, no singular moment of revelation. Instead, the transformation was like a rising tide, slow and steady, carrying the soul upward until it no longer felt bound by the limits of the physical or the fears of the mortal. The light around the soul began to shift, enveloping it in a warmth that felt like the embrace of 1,000 suns. The soul felt its essence expand, no longer confined to one form or one existence. The light grew brighter, and suddenly, the soul was not standing before the gods, but among them. Their radiance did not overshadow, it welcomed. The soul felt its own light growing, matching theirs in brilliance, as though the divinity within had been waiting patiently for this moment to awaken. The gods did not look down upon the soul, they stood as equals, their presence a reminder that every soul carries the spark of the eternal. In this state of oneness, the soul understood what it meant to be part of the divine. It was not about power or glory, it was about connection to the universe, to the lives it had touched, and to the infinite cycle of existence. The soul felt the rhythm of the cosmos, the pulsing of stars, and the gentle turning of the heavens. It was a symphony, and the soul was both a single note and the entire melody. There was a moment of stillness, a breath that stretched across eternity. Then, the gods stepped back, their forms dissolving into the light, leaving the soul alone yet surrounded by their presence. The soul felt no loneliness, only a profound sense of belonging. This was not an end, but a beginning, a merging with the eternal, where every thought, every memory, and every fragment of love would continue to exist, not as something separate, but as part of the divine. The light shifted again, and the soul saw the world below, not as a distant observer, but as a part of it. The rivers, the mountains, the people, all of it was connected, all of it alive with the same energy that now flowed through the soul. The deification was not a removal from existence, but an integration with it, a realization that the divine and the mortal were never truly separate. The soul's light burned brighter, not with the fire of conquest, but with the warmth of understanding. It was a beacon, a guide for those still walking the path of life, a reminder that the divine was not something to be reached, but something to be realized within. As the soul moved forward, its light intertwined with the cosmos, becoming part of the eternal dance of existence, where every soul, every life, and every moment was a thread in the infinite tapestry of the divine. The flickering light of oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, each carving on the tomb's surface whispering stories of eternity. A hush filled the chamber, a silence that carried reverence and awe. Here, in the sacred space where the living bid farewell to the dead, time itself seemed to pause. Every object, every ritual, was infused with meaning, a bridge between two worlds, one of flesh and the other of spirit. The tomb was more than a resting place, it was a sanctuary, a portal, and a promise. The air carried the faint scent of resin and spices, the final offerings of love and protection bestowed on a body now still. Mummification was no mere act of preservation, it was an art, a sacred duty. Each bandage wrapped around the lifeless form was a prayer, each incision a whisper to the gods. The hands of the embalmer moved with precision, guided by ancient knowledge passed down through generations. To watch this process was to witness a transformation, as the body was prepared not for decay but for eternity. Every step held weight, every gesture was deliberate. The removal of organs, the careful placement of amulets, the anointing with sacred oils, it was a symphony of devotion, a dialogue with the unseen. When the heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the body would need to reflect purity and dignity, for it was the vessel that had carried the soul through the trials of mortal life. To neglect this care was unthinkable, a betrayal of the journey that lay ahead. Once prepared, the body was placed within a sarcophagus, its surface adorned with intricate depictions of gods, symbols, and protective spells. These were not mere decorations, but guardians, companions for the long and treacherous path through the Duat. The sarcophagus itself felt alive, its golden sheen catching the light and shimmering like the first rays of dawn. It whispered promises of safety, of guidance, of eternal life. To gaze upon it was to feel the weight of generations who believed in the unbreakable bond between the living and the dead. The tomb stood ready, its chambers carved deep into the earth, a fortress against time and thieves. Its walls told stories in vibrant colors, scenes of feasting, hunting, and sailing on the celestial river. These were not memories of the past, but visions of the future, a reminder that the afterlife mirrored the joys of earthly existence. Every brushstroke was imbued with hope, a plea for continuity, a declaration that death was not an end but a transition. Offerings were laid with trembling hands, bread, fruits, wine, and meats, each one carefully chosen. These were gifts not only for sustenance but for connection. To place an offering was to affirm the bond between the living and the departed, to ensure that love would cross the boundaries of mortality. The act was simple, yet it carried the weight of eternity. The living believed that the dead could feel, could hunger, could thirst, and through these offerings, they ensured that their loved ones would never feel abandoned. Amulets were placed among the offerings, each one a symbol of protection and power. The Eye of Horus, a beacon of healing and safety. The scarab beetle, a symbol of rebirth and renewal. The ankh, a promise of life everlasting. These objects, small and unassuming, carried the force of generations of faith. To touch them was to feel the pulse of life itself, a reminder that even in death, the connection to the divine remained unbroken. As the tomb was sealed, the weight of the moment settled over all who stood witness. The heavy stone door groaned as it slid into place, the sound echoing like a final breath. Yet there was no despair, no wailing cries. Instead, there was a solemn understanding, a quiet acceptance that this was not goodbye but a passage. The tomb was not a prison but a sanctuary, a place where the soul could rest and prepare for the trials to come. The living would return, year after year, to light incense and speak words of remembrance. Their voices would carry through the still air, their prayers reaching out like threads of light. They would press their palms against the cool stone, feeling the faint hum of eternity beneath their fingertips. In these moments, the boundary between life and death blurred, and the presence of their loved ones felt as real as the air they breathed. And within the tomb, the offerings, the amulets, and the sacred inscriptions would wait patiently. They were not forgotten relics, but active participants in the journey. The bread would not decay, the wine would not sour, for they were transformed by belief, by love, by the enduring bond between the seen and the unseen. The tomb itself seemed to breathe, its walls alive with the energy of devotion and hope. The soul, wrapped in the care of these rituals, would rise. It would step forward into the darkness of the duat, carrying the strength of every prayer, every offering, every act of love. The gods would see the amulets, hear the whispered spells, and recognize the care that had been given. They would honor it, guiding the soul with compassion and justice. The trials would come, the scales would tip, but the soul would not face them alone. And so, the tomb stood, not as a monument to death, but as a testament to life. It was a place where the living and the dead met, where love transcended the limits of flesh and time. It was a reminder that no soul was forgotten, that every life was worthy of reverence and care. In the quiet stillness of the tomb, eternity waited, patient and unwavering, carrying the hopes of generations who dared to believe in something greater. The darkness seemed endless, yet it pulsed with a strange, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the universe itself. There was no sound, no movement, only the weight of silence pressing in from all sides. But within this void, something stirred, a faint flicker, fragile yet determined, like the first spark of a flame. It was the soul, weary from the trials it had endured, yet filled with a quiet strength that could not be extinguished. The soul had faced its judgment, had stood before the scales and the piercing gaze of Ma'at. It had felt the unbearable tension of the feathered balancing against its heart, the moments stretching into eternity. And then, the verdict, the soul was found worthy. A light unlike any other had enveloped it, warm and all-encompassing, washing away every fear, every lingering shadow. Yet this was not an ending. It was a beginning. The silence broke with a sound like 1,000 whispers carried on the wind. It was the voice of creation itself, calling the soul forward. A river of stars stretched out before it, shimmering and endless, each point of light a promise, a thread in the grand tapestry of existence. The soul moved toward the light, not with feet or wings, but with a pull that came from within, an instinct as old as time. There was no resistance, only surrender, as if it had always known this path, as if it had been waiting for this moment. And then, the light grew brighter, more intense, until it seemed to fill every corner of existence. The soul was no longer separate from it, it was part of the light, and the light was part of the soul. In this radiant embrace, the soul began to change. It was as if every fragment of its being was breaking apart, only to be rebuilt, stronger and more luminous than before. Memories, feelings, and dreams swirled together, not to be erased, but to be transformed. The weight of past mistakes dissolved, leaving behind only lessons, only wisdom. The process was not without pain. There was a moment when the soul felt as though it was being torn apart, its very essence stretched to the brink. But just as the pain reached its peak, it gave way to something indescribable, a joy so profound it brought tears even to the incorporeal. It was the joy of becoming, of stepping into a truth that had always been there, waiting to be claimed. The soul found itself in a garden unlike any it had ever known. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms, their colors so vibrant they seemed to hum with life. A river wound its way through the landscape, its waters sparkling like liquid gold. This was no ordinary place. It was the cradle of rebirth, where the old gave way to the new, where life and death intertwined in an eternal dance. Figures began to appear, their forms radiant and serene. They were not strangers, they were ancestors, guides, and companions from lives long past. Their eyes held a knowing kindness, as if they understood every joy, every sorrow the soul had ever experienced. They welcomed the soul not with words, but with presence, a connection that transcended language. And in their presence, the soul felt whole. A gentle voice, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, spoke from within the garden. It was not a command, but an invitation, a question that resonated through every fiber of the soul. Are you ready? There was no hesitation. The soul, now glowing with its own light, stepped forward. The river awaited, its surface calm yet rippling with an energy that promised transformation. As the soul entered the water, it felt a rush of sensations, as if it were experiencing life itself all over again. The laughter of a child, the embrace of a lover, the warmth of the sun on its skin, every moment, every emotion came flooding back, not as separate pieces, but as a unified whole. The soul was not just reliving, it was rebecoming. The river carried it gently, cradling it like a mother holding her child, until it reached the far shore. When the soul emerged, it was no longer what it had been. It was more. It was new. The light that surrounded it now shone from within, a beacon of life renewed. The figures in the garden smiled, their expressions a mixture of pride and joy, as if they too had been waiting for this moment. The soul had crossed the threshold, not as an end, but as a return to the essence of what it was always meant to be. The garden began to fade, not as a loss, but as a gentle reminder that this was only a step in a greater journey. The soul felt a pull, a call to something beyond, something vast and boundless. Yet this time, it felt no fear, no hesitation. It carried with it the strength of its rebirth, the light of its resurrection, and the knowledge that it was eternal. It moved toward its next destination, leaving behind the river, the garden, and the figures who had guided it. But they were not truly left behind. They were part of the soul now, woven into its very being. And as the soul stepped into the unknown, it carried with it a quiet, unshakable truth: life does not end. It transforms. It continues. It begins again. The waters of the Nile glistened under the moonlight, carrying with them whispers of ancient stories. Among them, one name resonated above all: Osiris. His tale was not just a legend, it was a heartbeat, a rhythm that pulsed through the veins of life and death. His name was spoken in prayers and tears, in hope and fear, for Osiris was more than a god. He was the keeper of eternity. In a world where life was fleeting and death loomed as an inevitable shadow, Osiris stood as a promise. He was not a distant deity, seated on a golden throne far removed from mortal struggles. No, Osiris had walked among the living. He had known love, betrayal, and the agony of death. Yet, through it all, he emerged as the symbol of resurrection, the one who could mend what was broken and breathe life into the lifeless. They say his body was torn apart, scattered across the lands by the hands of jealousy and greed. But Osiris's story did not end with his destruction. It began there. Piece by piece, he was brought back together, his body restored not just by magic but by devotion. Isis, his wife, his equal, his eternal companion, gathered his fragments with hands trembling yet determined. Her love transcended the boundaries of mortality, reaching into the depths of the unknown to reclaim him. When Osiris rose, he was no longer merely a man or a king. He became something greater, something eternal. The scars of his ordeal were not erased but transformed into marks of power, proof that death could be conquered. He was crowned as the ruler of the afterlife, his presence a light in the darkness that awaited every soul. To the living, he was a guide; to the dead, he was a savior. The story spoke of his court, a place where the soul stood before him, trembling but hopeful. Osiris, with his emerald skin and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of every star, did not judge with cruelty. He weighed the heart, not with the coldness of a distant god, but with the fairness of one who understood the weight of human choices. The scales tipped not for punishment but for truth, for balance. Those found worthy were not merely allowed to pass, they were welcomed, embraced into a life that was unending. There was a stillness in his presence, a peace that wrapped around the soul like a protective cloak. Yet, there was also power, a force that could not be denied. Osiris did not simply grant eternal life, he gifted purpose. In his realm, life was not stagnant but vibrant, a continuation of what had been, only richer, fuller. Fields of endless green stretched out before the souls who had passed his judgment, their beauty more radiant than anything the mortal world could offer. These were the fields of reeds, a paradise where every wish, every dream, found its fulfillment. But Osiris's role was not just to offer paradise. He was a reminder that death was not the end. His very existence was a defiance of that finality, a testament to the cycles of nature, where life always springs from what seems lost. Just as the Nile floods its banks each year, bringing life to the parched land, so too did Osiris flood the hearts of the faithful with hope. His story whispered to every ear willing to listen, no matter how dark the night, dawn will come. There was a weight to his gaze, as though he could see not just the actions, but the intentions behind them. To stand before him was to be seen in totality, every flaw and virtue laid bare. Yet his judgment was not harsh. It was compassionate, rooted in the understanding of a god who had once been human. Osiris did not demand perfection. He sought truth, sincerity, and the willingness to grow. The offerings left at his feet, the fragrant oils, the carefully wrapped shrouds, the words of prayer etched onto stone, were not acts of fear but of trust. To call upon Osiris was to believe in the possibility of something greater, something lasting. His followers did not just seek protection in death, they sought his guidance in life. Through him, they found the courage to face their own mortality, knowing that it was not an end but a passage. His voice, when it came, was soft yet unyielding, like the first winds of a storm. It carried not commands but truths, the kind that settled deep within, unshakable and eternal. To hear him was to feel both humbled and uplifted, to know that while life was fleeting, its essence was not. Every act, every choice, rippled outward, touching not just the present but the infinite. Osiris was not a god who demanded worship for his own glory. He was a shepherd, guiding his flock through the labyrinth of existence. He stood at the threshold between worlds, his arms open not to take but to give. Those who reached him did so not out of fear but out of a deep, unspoken understanding that he was their bridge to eternity. In the quiet of the tomb, where the air was thick with the scent of myrrh and the weight of silence, his presence could be felt. He was there in the carvings on the walls, in the prayers whispered by trembling lips, in the hearts of those who dared to hope. Osiris was not just a god of the dead, he was a god of life, of renewal, of the endless cycles that bind all creation. And so, his name was spoken, not just in temples but in the hearts of the living. For Osiris was more than a deity. He was a promise, a beacon in the night, a reminder that no matter how final death may seem, it is but a doorway to something eternal. The torchlight flickered across the stone walls, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits. In the dim glow, a figure stood motionless, his presence both haunting and comforting. His jackal-headed form was unmistakable, Anubis, the silent sentinel of the dead. His eyes, dark and unyielding, seemed to pierce through the veil separating life from death, seeing all, judging none. His stillness held a weight, an unspoken promise to guide those who could no longer guide themselves. There was no fear in his presence, though his form could strike terror. Instead, there was a quiet reassurance, a sense that no matter how disoriented the soul felt in its passage, it was not alone. Anubis was there. He had always been there. From the first breath of death to the final rites, his unseen hands guided every step, every moment, ensuring that nothing was left undone. The process began long before the soul crossed into the afterlife. When the body grew cold, when life slipped away like a fading ember, it was Anubis who stood watch. He was there in the careful hands of the embalmers, guiding their movements as they cleansed and prepared the lifeless form. Every incision, every anointment with sacred oils, every delicate wrapping of linen was performed under his watchful eye. To embalm the dead was not merely an act of preservation, it was a sacred ritual, a way of honoring the life that had been and protecting the soul as it ventured into the unknown. The embalming chamber was a place heavy with silence, broken only by the murmured prayers of those who worked there. Each step was performed with reverence, for they knew Anubis was present. His spirit lingered in the still air, in the solemnity of their movements, and the weight of their responsibility. The dead were not just bodies to be prepared, they were travelers, and Anubis was their guardian. Once the body was ready, the rituals began. Priests dressed in leopard skin stood over the deceased, reciting ancient words that carried power beyond human understanding. It was Anubis who guided their voices, ensuring the prayers reached the ears of the gods. The opening of the mouth ceremony was the most crucial, a moment when the soul was granted the ability to speak, to breathe, to feel once more. The priest, holding a sacred instrument, touched it to the lips of the deceased, and in that instant, it was as though Anubis himself breathed life into the lifeless. But Anubis's work did not end there. The body, now mummified and wrapped with care, was placed in its tomb, surrounded by treasures and offerings meant to sustain the soul in the afterlife. The tomb was not just a resting place, it was a gateway, a portal to the eternal. Anubis was the key. He guarded the entrance, ensuring no harm would come to the soul as it began its journey. The soul, disoriented and unsure, would find itself in the company of Anubis. He was not a god of grand speeches or flamboyant gestures. He spoke through action, through his steadfast presence. He led the soul with patience, his jackal form moving gracefully through the shadows. He knew the terrain well, every twist and turn of the path that led to the Hall of Two Truths. It was here, in this hallowed hall, that Anubis's role became even more vital. The scales of Maat stood at the center, gleaming under a light that seemed to come from nowhere. On one side rested the feather of truth, delicate and pure. On the other, the heart of the deceased, heavy with the weight of a lifetime. Anubis, steady and impartial, oversaw the weighing. He did not interfere, did not tip the scales. His role was not to judge, but to ensure fairness. The gods watched in silence, their gazes unblinking, but it was Anubis who controlled the ritual. His hands, though unseen, steadied the scales, ensuring that no falsehood could sway the outcome. For Anubis, truth was sacred, and only those whose hearts were as light as the feather could pass. When the scales balanced, a faint smile might have touched the corner of his lips. He did not celebrate, for his duty was not yet complete. He turned to the soul, his eyes meeting theirs, and without a word, he led them forward. There was no need for words. In his presence, the soul felt safe, guided by a force that knew no malice, no error, only purpose. For those whose hearts were too heavy, there was sorrow but no anger in Anubis's gaze. He did not condemn. He stepped aside, allowing Ammit to take what was hers. Even in this moment, there was dignity. Anubis ensured it. The soul was not forgotten, not abandoned. It was simply part of a cycle he had seen countless times before. In the stillness of the afterlife, Anubis's footsteps echoed softly. He moved through the shadows with purpose, his presence a constant reminder that the dead were never truly alone. He was the protector, the guide, the one who ensured that even in the uncertainty of death, there was order, there was care. To those who called upon him, who whispered his name in their final moments, Anubis was more than a god. He was a guardian, a friend, a silent companion in the darkest hour. His jackal head, so often misunderstood, was not a symbol of fear but of loyalty, of protection. The jackal knew the wilderness, knew how to navigate the desolation of the desert, and Anubis, like the jackal, guided the souls through the barren unknown, leading them to where they were meant to be. Through him, death was not an end but a passage, one that was navigated with care, with respect, with love. Anubis did not demand worship or fear. He only asked for trust, and in return, he offered a promise that no soul would be left to wander, no heart would be forgotten, and no life would end without purpose. In the silence of the afterlife, his presence was a beacon, unwavering, eternal. The wind howled through the desert, carrying with it the whispers of the forgotten, the voices of souls who had passed beyond the veil. In the farthest reaches of the heavens, where the gods dwell in eternal glory, Horus watches over them all. His eyes are sharp and unyielding, burning with the fierce protection that has defined his very existence. As the sun sets and the world drifts into the dark unknown, Horus stands vigilant, guarding the souls of those who have passed, keeping them from harm in a realm where only the purest may remain. When death comes, as it inevitably does, the soul is left to wander. Disoriented and fragile, it moves through a world unfamiliar and terrifying. Yet, no soul faces this journey alone. Horus is there, ever watchful, standing tall and proud as he gazes across the horizon with the power of a hawk. His wings spread wide, encompassing the heavens and the earth, wrapping every soul in his protective embrace. The dead are not abandoned. Not in the hands of Horus. His role is more than just a protector, it is a promise, a vow to keep the souls safe as they navigate the unknown. His watch is not a passive one. He is relentless, ever alert. Every step the soul takes, Horus is there, guarding against the dangers that lie beyond the afterlife's gates. Horus knows the risks. He has seen the shadows that lurk in the depths, the beasts and monsters that would seek to tear the soul apart, to drag it away into darkness. But Horus is stronger. His heart beats with the power of a god, and his soul is tempered by the trials of life and death. He has fought battles in the world of the living, and he brings that same fierce determination to the afterlife. When danger approaches, when the soul wavers on the edge of despair, Horus is there, his wings spreading wide like a shield, ready to defend. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, scan the horizon. He does not look away. In his gaze is the strength of 1,000 lifetimes. Nothing escapes his sight. The dead who seek peace find it in his presence. He guides them, not with words, but with an unspoken understanding that needs no explanation. His soul resonates with theirs, and they feel his protection wrap around them, a comforting warmth in the cold, unyielding void. But Horus's protection is not simply a shield from harm. It is a light in the dark. For those souls who fear the journey ahead, for those who tremble at the unknown, Horus is a beacon of hope. His presence is a reminder that they are not alone. His wings are vast, his feathers strong, and when the soul falters, he sweeps down, gentle yet unyielding, to lift them up. With Horus by their side, they can face the terrifying expanse that stretches before them, knowing they will never be left to face it alone. In moments of stillness, when the soul is uncertain, Horus is the constant. His unwavering presence is a balm to the anxious heart. He does not speak often, but when he does, it is with the weight of eternity in his voice, carrying the power to still even the most restless spirit. His words, though few, are always the right ones. His guidance is not forced, but patient. Horus knows that every soul must walk its path, but he is there, watching, protecting, ensuring that no step is taken without the strength to move forward. In the moments before the soul passes into the realm of the gods, when they stand on the precipice of judgment, Horus's protection becomes even more crucial. The soul must face the weighing of the heart, where the deeds of their life are measured against the feather of truth. And though the gods will decide, it is Horus who stands closest, his wings forming a shield around the soul. He does not judge, that is not his place. But he is there to ensure that the soul is not alone, that it has the strength to face whatever the scales reveal. It is in these moments, under the watchful gaze of Horus, that the soul feels its most vulnerable. The weight of a lifetime's choices presses heavy on their heart. But as the scales tip, Horus is there, a steady presence that reassures the soul. If the heart is light, if it has lived with honor, Horus will be the one to lift it, to carry it into the presence of the gods, where it will be granted its reward. And if the heart is heavy, if the soul must face judgment, Horus will stand by, unwavering, as the soul is guided to its final resting place, never left to wander in despair. Horus is the protector who never sleeps, the guardian who never falters. His power is not one of domination, but of compassion. He does not seek to control the souls under his care, but to guide them, to ensure they reach their destination with strength and grace. And when they do, when they finally stand before the gods, Horus is there, his wings spread wide, a symbol of hope and protection that never fades. For those who have crossed over, for those who have entered the afterlife, Horus remains a constant. He is the guardian of the soul, the protector of the journey. In the vastness of eternity, where the unknown looms large and dark, Horus is the light that guides the way. The soul, no matter how lost or uncertain, can always find solace in his presence. As the winds shift, as the desert sands change, Horus's eyes never leave the horizon. His wings, strong and unbroken, carry him across the heavens. For as long as there are souls to protect, Horus will be there, unyielding, eternal. The hall was silent, yet the air thrummed with an energy that felt alive. In the center stood the great scales, shimmering under an ethereal light, waiting to weigh a soul's worth. On one side rested a single feather, impossibly delicate, its weight more profound than any mountain. This was no ordinary feather, it was the feather of Ma'at, the embodiment of truth, the very essence of cosmic balance. And every soul, no matter how grand or humble, would stand before it. The soul trembled as it approached, uncertain yet unable to resist the pull. Life had ended, but something greater loomed. Memories of triumphs, failures, laughter, and regrets swirled together like a storm, each moment a whisper in the soul's ear. What would the scales say? Was the heart light, unburdened by deceit and cruelty? Or would it sink under the weight of lies and selfishness? The soul did not know. Only Ma'at could answer. She stood nearby, serene and unshaken, her gaze piercing yet calm. Ma'at wasn't a judge, not in the way mortals understood judgment. She did not accuse or condemn. Instead, she embodied something far more profound, the truth that could not be avoided, the order that could not be undone. Her presence was both comforting and terrifying. There was no hiding from Ma'at, no room for excuses or justifications. In her presence, the soul was laid bare, stripped of pretense and illusion. The scales began to shift. Every beat of the soul's heart seemed to echo in the vast hall, the sound growing louder, more insistent. The feather of Ma'at remained still, unmoved, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. Time slowed, stretching into an eternity, as the weight of the soul was revealed. Ma'at's principles were not rules imposed by some distant authority, they were the very fabric of existence. Truth, justice, balance, these were not ideals but the forces that kept chaos at bay, that held the universe together. Without Ma'at, there would be no stars, no sunrise, no life. And in this moment, under the unflinching gaze of eternity, every soul was measured against her eternal standard. The soul's memories grew louder, spilling forth like an unstoppable tide. Kindness given to a stranger. A lie told in haste. A promise broken. A love nurtured. Every action, every thought, every decision, it all mattered. And yet, the scales did not weigh deeds alone. They measured the intent, the truth behind the mask. Was the soul honest, not just with others, but with itself? Did it live in harmony with Ma'at's principles, or did it turn away, letting selfish desires and falsehoods take root? Ma'at watched without judgment, her presence as steady as the stars. She was not cruel, though her truth could cut deeper than any blade. Her feather, so light it seemed to float on air, carried the weight of the universe. It was unyielding, incorruptible, and the soul felt its power like a force pressing down on its very essence. There were souls who had walked through life without a thought for balance, for truth. They were consumed by greed, by hatred, by the illusion that their actions did not matter. And when they stood before Ma'at, their hearts heavy with the burdens they had created, the scales tipped. The feather rose, light as ever, and the heart sank, pulled down by the weight of its own lies. These were the moments that echoed with the wails of the lost, the cries of those who had forsaken Ma'at's principles and now faced the consequences. But there were others, souls who had stumbled, who had fallen, but who had always strived to rise again. They were not perfect, for no one was. But they had sought truth, had tried to live in harmony with the world around them. Their hearts, though scarred, were light, unburdened by deceit. When these souls stood before the scales, the feather and the heart balanced perfectly, and Ma'at's silent approval shone through the stillness. The hall grew brighter, the light reflecting off the scales, as if the universe itself celebrated the balance restored. For Ma'at's principles were not just about judgment, they were about harmony, about setting right what had been thrown off course. Every soul that balanced the scales contributed to the cosmic order, strengthening the foundation of existence itself. Ma'at's eyes never wavered. She saw every soul for what it truly was, beyond the masks and illusions. Her gaze was not harsh, but it demanded honesty. The soul felt it, that silent urging to let go of pretenses, to stand naked in its truth. And in doing so, it found freedom. For to align with Ma'at was not to be bound by rules, it was to be liberated from the chains of falsehood, to live in harmony with the order of all things. The scales stilled. The feather rested, unchanged, its lightness a testament to its unwavering truth. The soul's weight was revealed, its essence laid bare for all to see. Ma'at stepped forward, her presence like a calm wind after a storm. She did not speak, for her silence spoke volumes. The balance of the scales was all the answer needed. And so, the soul moved on, its fate decided by the truth it carried within. Ma'at remained, ever watchful, her feather ready to weigh the next soul, her principles unbroken. She was more than a goddess, she was the heartbeat of the universe, the light that guided the lost, the truth that could never be silenced. The path was shrouded in an otherworldly mist, its silence broken only by the faint rustle of unseen movements. It wasn't the overwhelming stillness that unsettled, it was the sense of presence, a watchful energy lingering in the shadows. The soul had crossed the threshold, entering the land beyond life, where the unknown became tangible and the spirits of the afterlife stirred. They weren't alone. Never alone. Invisible to mortal eyes, but undeniable in their existence, ancient spirits and deities worked tirelessly to guide, guard, and sometimes challenge those who dared to tread this sacred passage. Each figure had a purpose, their presence woven into the fabric of eternity. From the mist, faint whispers emerged, like the voices of 1,000 lifetimes speaking all at once. The soul paused, instinctively looking around, though no form yet took shape. It was then that the first spirit appeared, her steps as soft as the light filtering through the haze. She was Heka, the personification of magic itself. Her movements seemed effortless, yet her gaze held unfathomable power. Heka's role was unseen but essential, threading together the spells and rites that bound this world to the next. Without her, the bridges between realms would crumble, and chaos would reign. Heka's presence wasn't comforting or terrifying, it was steady, like the pulse of the universe. She touched the soul lightly, as if granting permission to move forward, her touch tingling with an energy that echoed through every fragment of their being. Then, like a fleeting thought, she vanished. Not all spirits were gentle. From the darker corners came forms that seemed to shift and flicker, barely clinging to shape. These were the Shut, the shadow selves of the departed. They represented what lingered behind, the echoes of the soul, tethered to the world of the living. The Shut didn't harm, but their presence was a reminder of the burdens left unresolved. They loomed close, their dark forms whispering secrets of a life left incomplete. To move past them, the soul needed courage, for the Shut could drag the hesitant back, trapping them in an endless cycle of regret. As the soul pressed on, the air grew denser, charged with an electric anticipation. And then he appeared with Kurti, the ram-headed guardian of the underworld. His presence was massive, his form imposing as he stood between the soul and the next passage. Curdy's role wasn't to punish but to test. He demanded strength and determination, his unblinking gaze challenging the soul to confront its fears. Some faltered under that gaze, their spirits breaking, unable to withstand the weight of their own failings. But those who met his eyes with resolve found themselves guided past his watchful post, their path lit by his reluctant approval. In the quieter moments, when the oppressive tension eased, there came a lightness, a fleeting reprieve. Enter Shai, the deity of destiny and fate. His presence was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably significant. He carried the record of every soul's life, a scroll inscribed with every choice, every action, and every consequence. Shai didn't judge, he simply presented the truth. The soul felt his presence like the weight of their own memories, bittersweet and undeniable. Shai wasn't alone. By his side was Renenutit, the cobra goddess of nourishment and protection. Her emerald scales glimmered in the faint light, her movements graceful and deliberate. Renenutit whispered blessings to the deserving, offering comfort and strength to those whose hearts carried the burdens of an honorable life. Her words were a balm, a promise that even in death, there was care and compassion. Her emerald eyes gleamed as she offered the soul a brief, kind smile before slithering away into the unseen. The path twisted and turned, becoming narrower and darker. It was here that the presence of Ammit loomed, a figure that struck terror into even the bravest hearts. With the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippo, Ammit waited for the unworthy. She was not cruel, but she was unrelenting. If a soul's heart tipped the scales with the weight of sin and deceit, Ammit would devour it, ending its chance at eternity. The soul didn't encounter her directly, but her shadow lingered in the distance, a silent reminder of the stakes at hand. From the darkness came another figure, lithe and swift, moving with an almost playful energy. This was Bes, the dwarf god known for his fierce protection. His unusual form, with a broad face and wild hair, often brought smiles to the living, but in the afterlife, his purpose was far greater. Bes stood guard against malevolent forces, his cheerful demeanor belying his unyielding strength. He fought for the soul's safe passage, warding off creatures and spirits that sought to harm. Bes was a reminder that even in the shadow of death, there were protectors, unwavering and brave. The journey was far from over. In the distance, the figure of Aker could be seen, the twin lion-headed god who guarded the entrance and exit to the afterlife. Aker's role was to ensure the cycle of death and rebirth continued without disruption. He represented the boundary between worlds, his twin forms watching over past and future. As the soul approached, the lions roared, their voices echoing like thunder, signaling that the final stages of the passage were near. Through every step, the spirits and deities worked in harmony, their roles interconnected. Some guided, some tested, some protected, and others merely observed. Together, they created a tapestry of existence that transcended the mortal understanding of life and death. The soul could feel their presence at every turn, their actions shaping the path ahead, their influence impossible to ignore. Each spirit, each deity, carried an unshakable purpose, their actions governed not by whim but by the sacred order of the afterlife. They weren't merely guardians or guides, they were the essence of the journey itself, their roles as eternal as the stars. And as the soul moved forward, one truth became clear: the afterlife wasn't a solitary experience. It was a collaboration, a sacred dance between the departed and the ancient forces that governed their fate. The Nile ran still that night, its surface like polished obsidian under a moon that hung heavy and watchful. The air carried a silence that felt alive, as if every creature, every grain of sand, was holding its breath. Somewhere in the shadows, whispers passed like echoes of an ancient wound. A betrayal had taken root, and a tragedy was unfolding that would change the balance of all existence. Osiris, the beloved king, stood at the height of his reign. He was not just a ruler but a nurturer, a god who had gifted humanity with the secrets of agriculture and law, pulling them from chaos into harmony. His presence was magnetic, his wisdom unmatched, and his compassion limitless. People spoke his name with reverence, their hearts swelling with gratitude for the peace he brought to the land. But greatness, as it often does, casts a shadow, and in that shadow, envy festered. Set, Osiris's own brother, watched him with eyes that burned with bitterness. Where Osiris was celebrated, Set felt forgotten. Every accolade given to Osiris was like a thorn driven into Set's pride. His heart grew darker with each passing day, until his envy twisted into hatred, and his hatred demanded blood. The trap was set during a grand feast, a celebration of life, family, and unity. Set, with a smile as sharp as a blade, presented a magnificent chest, crafted with intricate detail and shimmering with gold. He declared it a gift, a prize for whoever could fit perfectly within it. One by one, the guests tried, laughter filling the air as they failed to fit. Then Osiris stepped forward, his tall, regal frame sliding effortlessly into the chest. In that instant, the laughter turned to gasps as Set slammed the lid shut, sealing it with molten lead. The room erupted into chaos, but it was too late. The chest was carried away, disappearing into the Nile's embrace, its weight dragging it into the murky depths. Osiris, the heart of Egypt, was gone. And with him, it seemed, went the light of the world. Isis, Osiris's wife, refused to let despair claim her. Her grief was a storm, but within it burned a fierce determination. She scoured the land, searching endlessly for her beloved's body. Her tears watered the earth, her cries echoed in the winds, but she would not stop. She called upon Nephthys, Set's own wife and her loyal sister, to aid her. Together, they braved the dangers of the wild, their hearts beating with one purpose, to find Osiris. The chest was finally discovered, hidden within the tangled roots of a great tree. But the sight that awaited Isis shattered her. Osiris's body, lifeless and cold, lay before her. Yet even in her heartbreak, she refused to surrender. She pieced him back together with hands that trembled but never faltered. She sang to him, her voice carrying ancient words of power, weaving magic as potent as her love. Her devotion reached the heavens, and the gods themselves took notice. It was Anubis, the jackal-headed protector of the dead, who performed the first rites of embalming. He wrapped Osiris in linen, an act so sacred it would become a ritual for all eternity. And then, with the breath of the goddess of life, Osiris stirred. His resurrection was not of this world, it was something eternal, something that transcended life as mortals knew it. Osiris had conquered death, but he could not remain among the living. His place was now in the underworld, where he would reign as the judge of souls, the keeper of Ma'at. Set, meanwhile, was unrelenting. Even with Osiris gone, his thirst for power knew no bounds. But he had underestimated the son born of Isis's grief and magic, Horus. The falcon-headed god grew strong, fueled by the memory of his father's betrayal and his mother's sorrow. The battle between Horus and Set was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The skies darkened, the earth trembled, and the gods themselves watched as the two clashed, their struggle rippling across creation. Horus's victory wasn't just personal, it was cosmic. He restored balance, avenging his father and securing the throne of Egypt. But even in defeat, Set was not destroyed. He became the god of chaos, a reminder that darkness could never be completely extinguished, only balanced by light. Osiris, now enthroned in the underworld, became the cornerstone of the afterlife. His death and resurrection weren't just stories, they were a promise. To the people of Egypt, he was proof that death was not the end but a passage, a transformation. The rituals performed in his name weren't mere traditions, they were acts of faith, binding the living to the departed in a cycle that mirrored the flooding and receding of the Nile. The afterlife wasn't a guarantee, it was earned. Osiris stood at the center of it all, weighing the hearts of the dead against the feather of Ma'at. Those who lived with truth and justice found themselves welcomed into eternal fields of bliss, their souls nourished by the same God who had once taught their ancestors to cultivate the land. But those whose hearts were heavy with deceit and cruelty faced annihilation, their existence devoured by Ammit, leaving no trace behind. Osiris's story wasn't just about him. It was about the interconnectedness of all things, the bonds of love, the consequences of betrayal, the unyielding power of justice, and the eternal dance between life and death. His myth breathed life into the afterlife, making it a place not of fear but of hope and purpose. It taught that even in the face of unspeakable loss, there could be redemption, and that through courage, love, and sacrifice, even the darkest night could give way to dawn. The soul trembled as it left the body, a flicker of light torn from the warmth of the earthly world. Darkness pressed close, suffocating and unfamiliar, but a faint glow appeared in the distance, a portal, shimmering and alive. The soul moved toward it, pulled by an invisible force. Beyond the threshold lay the Duat, the land of the afterlife, vast and enigmatic, where only the bravest could pass. The air was heavy, thick with the whispers of ancient spirits. Shadows danced across the jagged walls of a cavernous passageway, their forms twisting into faces, some sorrowful, others menacing. The soul hesitated, but there was no turning back. Ahead, the river of the dead stretched endlessly, its waters black and still, as if holding secrets too heavy to flow. A lone ferryman waited, his hollow eyes piercing the silence. He extended a skeletal hand, demanding payment for safe passage. The soul offered a fragment of its earthly memories, a cherished moment from a sunlit day long ago. The ferryman nodded and motioned for the soul to step aboard his creaking vessel. The boat moved silently, cutting through the inky waters. The stars above were unfamiliar, constellations that seemed to shift and watch, their gaze both comforting and unnerving. Midway through the river, the calm shattered. The waters began to churn violently as monstrous forms emerged, their bodies serpentine and eyes glowing with malevolence. The soul clung to the boat, fear clawing at its very essence. The ferryman spoke no words but raised his staff, striking it against the boat's edge. A brilliant light erupted, forcing the creatures back into the depths, their anguished cries fading into the void. The boat reached the shore, and the ferryman vanished as though he had never existed. The soul stood before a towering gate guarded by a figure of immense power, Anubis, the jackal-headed protector of the dead. His eyes glowed like embers, and his presence was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Without a word, he extended his hand, holding the scales of Ma'at. On one side rested the feather of truth, shimmering with divine light. The soul's heart was placed on the other side, quivering under the weight of its deeds. Time seemed to stop as the scales tipped back and forth, their movements agonizingly slow. Every lie, every cruelty, and every unkind thought became a weight pressing down, while every act of love and kindness lifted it. The soul waited, its essence trembling with the fear of judgment. But the scales balanced, and Anubis nodded, a flicker of approval in his otherwise stern gaze. The gate creaked open, revealing the path ahead. The soul stepped forward, entering a maze of tunnels, each turn more disorienting than the last. The air grew colder, and the sound of dripping water echoed endlessly. In the shadows, voices began to call out, soft at first, but growing louder and more desperate. "Help me," they cried. "Don't leave me here." The soul paused, torn between compassion and self-preservation. To stop meant risking being trapped forever, yet to ignore the cries felt like an unbearable betrayal of its own humanity. Finally, the soul reached out, grasping the hand of one of the voices. The shadows recoiled, revealing not a tormented spirit, but an illusion, a test of its character. The path ahead lit up, guiding the soul forward. The maze opened into a vast desert, the sands glowing under a blood-red sky. Here, the soul faced the final trial, the great serpent Apep, the embodiment of chaos. Its body coiled like a storm, its eyes burning with ancient fury. Apep lunged, its jaws wide enough to swallow existence itself. The soul braced itself, drawing on every ounce of courage it had ever known. It was not alone. The spirits of ancestors appeared, their hands outstretched, their voices echoing encouragement. "You are stronger than fear," they said. "You are more than your failures." The soul raised its hands, and from within it, a light erupted, pure and unwavering. The serpent shrieked, its form dissolving into ash as the light consumed it. The desert grew silent once more, the sky shifting from red to a serene gold. The soul, battered but unbroken, moved forward. At last, the soul reached the Hall of Two Truths, a place of indescribable beauty. Columns carved with stories of gods and mortals stretched endlessly, their surfaces alive with light. At the center sat Osiris, his presence filling the space with an overwhelming sense of peace. The soul approached, its journey complete but its fate still uncertain. Osiris looked deep into the essence of the soul, his gaze penetrating every secret, every hidden corner. But there was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. He spoke no words, yet the soul felt his verdict, not as a punishment or reward, but as a truth it had always known. The gates to the field of reeds opened, a place where the soul would find rest, purpose, and reunion with all it had lost. The soul stepped through, the weight of its trials lifting like mist in the morning sun. The journey had been harsh, but it had forged the soul into something unbreakable. It was not the same as it had been in life, it was more. The scent of incense filled the air, heavy and sweet, curling like unseen fingers through the dimly lit chamber. Shadows flickered on the walls, cast by the flames of oil lamps as priests moved with deliberate precision. The body lay still, swathed in linen, its silence almost deafening amidst the murmurs of prayers and the rhythmic beat of a sacred drum. This was no ordinary ritual, this was a bridge between life and eternity, where every word, every gesture, held the weight of the divine. The family stood nearby, their faces etched with grief and reverence. This was not just about loss, it was about ensuring the departed could find their way in the perilous afterlife. Tears fell silently, not out of despair but out of hope, hope that their loved one would pass the trials ahead and be reborn in the land of eternal peace. The priest, clad in white linen, raised his hands, calling upon the gods to bear witness. His voice echoed through the chamber, low and haunting, as if the walls themselves carried the words to the heavens. Beside him lay the sacred tools, gleaming in the firelight, small blades, amulets, and the ceremonial adze. These objects, simple yet profound, would guide the soul toward its destiny. The opening of the mouth ceremony began. This act was no mere superstition, it was a moment of raw, spiritual power. The priest leaned over the body, holding the adze delicately, almost as if afraid to disturb the stillness of death. He touched it to the lips of the deceased, murmuring ancient words meant to restore the senses for the afterlife. The soul, they believed, needed to see, hear, taste, and speak once more to navigate the treacherous path to the field of reeds. Each touch of the adze was a prayer, a plea to the gods to grant the dead a second birth. In the background, women chanted softly, their voices weaving a tapestry of sorrow and hope. They were the mourners, their cries not of despair but of devotion. They invoked Isis and Nephthys, the divine sisters who had once wept for Osiris. Their lamentations filled the room, their voices rising and falling like waves, a sound that seemed to pierce the veil between this world and the next. The next stage was the purification of the body. Water, sacred and pure, was poured gently over the shrouded form. This was not just cleansing, it was a renewal, a symbolic washing away of the earthly ties that bound the soul. The priest moved with reverence, his hand steady, his face solemn. He whispered prayers as the water trickled down, asking the gods to accept the soul and protect it from the chaos that lurked in the shadows of the afterlife. Amulets were placed carefully among the wrappings of the mummy, each one a shield against the dangers ahead. The heart scarab, heavy with inscriptions, was tucked close to where the heart had once beat. Its purpose was clear, to silence the heart during judgment, to prevent it from speaking out against the soul during the weighing of deeds. The eye of Horus rested over the chest, a symbol of protection, its gaze unyielding in the face of evil. The priests worked tirelessly, wrapping the body with strips of linen that carried prayers written in ink. These were more than cloth, they were layers of magic, binding the soul with the blessings of the gods. With each turn of the linen, the family whispered final goodbyes, their words mixing with the chants of the priests. It was a moment of heartbreaking beauty, where love transcended the divide of life and death. Once the wrappings were complete, the coffin was prepared. Adorned with vibrant paintings and hieroglyphs, it told the story of the deceased's life and their journey to come. The image of Nut, the sky goddess, stretched across the lid, her arms open to cradle the soul in the stars. The coffin was not just a container, it was a vessel, a guide through the do-it. As the coffin was sealed, the final ritual began, the offering of food and drink. Platters of bread, fruits, and meats were laid before the deceased, along with jars of wine and water. These offerings were more than sustenance, they were gifts to sustain the soul during its perilous journey. The aroma of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the chamber, a poignant reminder of life's fleeting pleasures. The priest lifted his hands one last time, his voice rising in a final prayer. He called upon Osiris, the lord of the underworld, to welcome the soul with open arms. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking deep into the hearts of all present. The family knelt, their foreheads touching the ground, as if their devotion could carry the soul further. The procession to the tomb began at dawn, the rising sun casting long shadows on the sand. The coffin was carried on a sled, surrounded by mourners who sang hymns to Ra, the sun god. The desert wind whispered through the dunes, carrying the voices far beyond the horizon. It was a solemn march, yet there was an undercurrent of hope, a belief that the soul would rise again, like the sun that now bathed them in its golden light. At the tomb, the final offerings were made. A priest placed a papyrus scroll containing spells from the Book of the Dead beside the mummy, a guidebook for the soul's trials in the afterlife. The tomb walls were inscribed with images of gods and symbols of protection, a fortress of magic to ward off evil spirits. The moment came to seal the tomb. The family lingered, their hands touching the stone as if reluctant to let go. Tears flowed freely now, the finality of the moment crashing down upon them. But even as the heavy door closed, shutting out the world, there was a sense of peace. They knew they had done everything they could to prepare their loved one for the challenges ahead. As the tomb stood silent and still, the wind outside picked up, carrying grains of sand across the desert. Somewhere in the unseen, the soul took its first steps into the afterlife, armed with the love, prayers, and rituals that had bridged the gap between this world and the next. The parchment crackled faintly as it was unrolled, the faint scent of age rising from its surface. On its fibers, the ink, black and crimson, still shone with purpose, as if it carried the weight of eternity itself. The ancient priest ran his fingers lightly across the symbols, his touch reverent, his expression one of quiet awe. This was no ordinary text. It was life beyond death, salvation etched in hieroglyphs. The Book of the Dead was not meant for the living. Its words whispered to those who no longer drew breath, those who stood at the edge of existence, peering into the unknown. It wasn't just a book, it was a map, a shield, and a voice in the silence. To a wandering soul, it was everything. Without it, the afterlife could be endless torment, a labyrinth where the unprepared would be consumed by chaos. With it, there was a chance, not just for survival but for everlasting peace. Each page was alive with stories of gods and monsters, of courage and despair. The ink seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, as if drawing energy from the sacred space. These were spells, incantations, and pleas written with trembling hands, words that had been passed down for generations. The book was not bound in leather or held together by glue. It was a collection of papyri, scattered and reassembled, carried with the dead into their tombs like treasures more precious than gold. The priests read aloud the spell to open the gates of the afterlife. Their voices rose and fell in rhythm, calling out to the unseen. It was said the gates were guarded by beings older than time, whose eyes burned like fire and whose hearts were colder than stone. They demanded answers, riddles spoken with perfect precision. One wrong word, one stumble of the tongue, and the gates would remain closed forever. But this book, this fragile, powerful book, held the answers. In its pages were instructions for the soul's perilous journey through the Duat, the land of shadows. It spoke of the river that wound through darkness, where crocodiles with razor-sharp teeth lurked beneath the surface, waiting for the careless to drift too close. There were passages about flames that leapt up without warning, consuming everything in their path, and sands that shifted endlessly, trapping the unwary. The Book of the Dead gave the soul the tools to navigate these dangers, to call upon the gods for protection, to command the elements to obey. One spell was meant to grant the power of transformation. It allowed the soul to take the form of a falcon and soar above the treacherous landscape, its wings cutting through the darkness. Another promised the ability to turn into a lotus, blooming in the light of Ra, the sun god, untouched by the chaos below. To read these words was to feel the hope of flight, the sweetness of escape, even as the shadows pressed closer. Then there was the spell for the weighing of the heart. The priests paused when they reached this part, their voices trembling slightly. This was the moment of truth, the ultimate test. The heart was placed on a scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth. If the heart was heavy with sin, it would tip the scale, and the soul would be devoured by Ammit, the monster that waited patiently for its next meal. But the Book of the Dead offered more than a warning, it offered a way to pass. It taught the soul to declare its innocence, to speak the 42 negative confessions with confidence and clarity. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused pain unjustly. Each confession was a key, unlocking the gates to a new level of existence. The soul had to recite them flawlessly, believing each word with every fiber of its being. The book provided these confessions like a lifeline, an unbreakable thread that could pull even the most fragile soul to safety. The illustrations in the book were as haunting as the words. Jackals prowled beside rivers of blood, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Serpents coiled around pillars of fire, hissing curses that seemed to leap from the page. Yet amidst the darkness, there were glimpses of beauty. The field of reeds, a paradise of endless green, stretched out in perfect tranquility, its waters shimmering beneath a golden sky. The soul was promised this peace, this joy, but only if it followed the guidance of the text. The priests reached the spell that called upon Isis and Nephthys, the sisters of sorrow and strength. Their voices softened, almost breaking, as they invoked the goddesses who had once pieced Osiris back together, breath by breath, word by word. The spell begged for mercy, for compassion, for the same unyielding love that had defied death itself. In the quiet of the tomb, their words seemed to echo endlessly, as if the walls themselves were carrying the prayer to the heavens. The Book of the Dead didn't end with triumph. It ended with a question, an uncertainty that left even the boldest soul trembling. Would the gods accept the pleas? Would the trials be passed? It offered no guarantees, only the tools to try. And that was what made it so powerful. It wasn't a promise, it was a chance. The priests carefully rolled the parchment back up, their movements slow and deliberate. It would be placed beside the body, a final gift to the departed. As they stepped away, the air in the chamber felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. This book wasn't just words on a page, it was hope, fear, and the fragile beauty of the human spirit, fighting against the void. And as the tomb door closed, sealing the book with the soul it was meant to protect, the silence that followed was almost deafening. The sound of mournful chants filled the air, mingling with the scent of burning incense, as the body lay in the center of the room, wrapped in layers of linen and oils. The family gathered around, their faces somber, their hands trembling as they placed amulets, charms, and offerings near the deceased. The silence was thick with reverence, for they all knew what was about to happen. This was not just the end, it was the beginning of a journey to another world, a world that could only be reached with proper preparation, guidance, and sacrifice. For the common people, death was a solemn event, but it was also one that could not be ignored. They, too, believed in the afterlife, and a continuation beyond the physical world, and they knew that the journey could be long and treacherous. Without the grandeur of the pharaoh's tombs or the extravagant rituals reserved for the elite, the everyday Egyptians still carried out their duties with the same solemnity. In a small, humble home, the body was washed, dressed in simple clothes, and placed in a modest tomb, where food offerings would be left for the soul's journey. But the greatest gift they could offer was their love, their prayers, and the hope that the deceased would find their way safely to the afterlife. For the common Egyptian, the afterlife was not just a distant dream. It was a continuation of their life on earth, where they would still need food, shelter, and protection. The body might be small, and the wealth might be meager, but the rituals were just as meaningful. The offerings of bread, beer, and honey were simple, but they were given with the deepest affection and respect. The family would gather once more to light candles and incense, to call upon the gods to protect their loved one as they passed through the realm of the dead. Even in the humblest of graves, the spirit would not be alone, it would be watched over by the gods, and its passage would be ensured by the careful and loving hands of those left behind. But for the pharaohs, the journey was far grander, far more elaborate. Their tombs were vast, filled with treasures that would ensure they would never want for anything in the afterlife. These were the rulers of Egypt, the gods among men, and their burial preparations reflected their exalted status. The grand processions, the elaborate embalming, the wealth of offerings, they were all designed to protect, to honor, and to guide the soul into the next world. As the pharaoh's body was prepared for burial, the embalmers would carefully remove the organs, each one placed in its own canopic jar to preserve it for the soul's future use. The body itself would be dried and wrapped in fine linen, the skin treated with oils and resins to ensure its eternal preservation. Gold and jewels would be placed in the tomb with the pharaoh, along with statues of servants, so that he would never be alone. Every detail was attended to with the utmost care because the pharaoh's passage to the afterlife was not only a personal journey, it was a sacred obligation. The people's fate, their prosperity, was believed to depend on the ruler's successful journey through the afterlife. And so, every precaution was taken to ensure that he would be granted safe passage, that he would be protected by the gods and enter the field of reeds, where eternal peace awaited. The moment of burial for the pharaoh was a grand spectacle. The people would gather, their voices rising in praise as the body was lowered into the tomb, a tomb that would serve as the ruler's eternal home. The tombs were massive, built to withstand the test of time, carved into the stone of mountains or buried deep beneath the earth, filled with everything a king might need for his eternal life. The walls of the tombs were inscribed with prayers, spells, and blessings, ensuring that the pharaoh would be guided through every trial that lay ahead. The journey to the afterlife wasn't easy for anyone, even the gods among men. The soul had to pass through the Duat, a dangerous and uncertain place, where dangers lurked at every corner. But for the pharaoh, the path was clearer, guided by the blessings of the gods and the rituals performed on his behalf. The heart, weighed by the gods, had to be light with truth and justice. The prayers spoken over the pharaoh's body were meant to ensure that his heart would not falter, that it would pass the judgment of Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and be declared worthy. In the royal tombs, the process was as much about protecting the pharaoh from the dangers of the afterlife as it was about preserving his body. This was not just about death, it was about the preservation of the soul, the continuation of the kingdom's legacy. The pharaoh's tombs were filled with treasures, yes, but more importantly, they were filled with prayers, with protection, with the very essence of life itself. And yet, no matter the grandeur or simplicity of the tomb, the passage was still uncertain. For no one could truly know what awaited beyond the veil of death. The heart was weighed, the soul was judged, and all the offerings in the world could not change the outcome if the soul was not prepared. Even for the pharaoh, the journey to the afterlife was fraught with danger. There were monsters to face, gods to please, and darkness to endure. But there was always hope, a faint glimmer that even the most humble soul, if prepared, might make it through to the other side. As the tombs were sealed, whether humble or grand, a silence fell over the land. It was not a silence of emptiness, but a silence of hope, a quiet prayer that the soul would be carried through the trials ahead. The living would wait, would carry on, always knowing that the ones they loved had made the journey. They had taken their steps toward eternity, and though they might never return, they would never be forgotten. The rituals were more than customs, they were a way of ensuring that the cycle of life and death would continue, that love would endure, that the afterlife would always be within reach, no matter who you were. The sun sets over the vast desert, casting long shadows over the towering structure that stands like a sentinel against time. The Great Pyramid of Giza, massive and ancient, seems to pulse with an energy all its own. Its stone sides glow faintly in the fading light, and the air around it hums with whispers of the past. This is no ordinary building. This is not just a tomb. It is a doorway to the afterlife, a monument to a soul's passage from the living world to eternity. As the pyramid rises into the sky, its size is both awe-inspiring and humbling. The weight of the stone, the years it took to build, and the sheer ambition behind it all leave a profound impression on anyone who dares to stand before it. But it wasn't just the pharaohs who would gaze upon their tombs with awe, it was the entire kingdom. For this was a place not just for the dead, but for the living, too. The tombs of the pharaohs were not merely their final resting place, they were the beacons that would guide their souls to the afterlife, protecting them for eternity. The grand tombs, rising like mountains in the desert, were a reflection of the gods themselves. They were constructed with one purpose in mind, to ensure the pharaoh's safe passage into the next life. Every block, every stone, was placed with the knowledge that this was more than just architecture. This was a gateway, a sacred space where the soul of the king would enter the realm of the gods, where he would be reborn, transformed, and made immortal. The intricate chambers hidden deep within these pyramids were not just rooms filled with treasure, but spaces designed to protect the soul as it began its journey. Carved into the walls were inscriptions, spells meant to ward off evil and offer guidance to the pharaoh as he crossed into the unknown. These writings were not simply words, they were a lifeline, a connection between the living and the dead, between the mortal and the divine. The gods, the protectors, the spirits of the land, they all watched over the tomb, ensuring the soul's safe passage. Without these protections, the journey would have been perilous, filled with danger and uncertainty. Inside the tomb, the pharaoh's body would rest, carefully preserved for eternity. Surrounded by treasures and offerings, the body was meant to be a vessel for the soul's return. In the tombs, the living would place food, clothes, jewelry, and sacred objects to ensure the king would have everything he needed on his journey. But it wasn't just about the physical things. The offerings were also symbolic, signs of respect, devotion, and hope. The living believed that if they honored the pharaoh in this way, he would look after them in the afterlife, ensuring the prosperity of Egypt. As the massive stones of the tomb were sealed, the air would grow still, heavy with the weight of finality. But in the hearts of those who remained behind, there was always the hope that their king would be able to join the gods in the afterlife. They believed that the pharaoh's soul would ascend to the skies, where he would become one with the sun god Ra, and his spirit would live on forever. The tomb was not just a burial site, it was the portal through which the soul would rise, transformed, into a higher plane. The grandeur of the pyramid stood as a testament to the belief that the soul's journey didn't end with death. The tomb was not just a physical space, it was a sacred vessel designed to carry the pharaoh's spirit to the eternal world. Its towering height was a symbol of the king's divine status, a bridge between the heavens and the earth. The tomb's shape itself, a triangle, represented the rays of the sun, linking the pharaoh to Ra, the god who would light his way into the afterlife. The pyramid was the perfect symbol of rebirth, a structure designed to allow the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the stars, where it would live on forever. But not all the tombs were the same. Some were humble, others grand, but each one was crafted with care. Every tomb, whether a small pit in the sand or a towering pyramid, was a symbol of hope. The common people may not have had the same wealth or resources as the pharaohs, but their tombs, too, were designed to ensure their souls would reach the afterlife. The tombs of the common people, though simple, were still filled with offerings and prayers. Small pots of food, statues of gods, and amulets were left as gifts for the deceased. These simple acts of love and devotion were meant to ensure the soul would not be lost or forgotten. Even for the greatest pharaoh, the tomb was not a guarantee. The tombs were built to protect, but they also had to be guarded by the gods. The pharaoh's soul had to pass through the dangers of the Duat, the underworld, where it would be judged by Osiris. The tomb itself was a symbol of the king's hope for a successful judgment. It was a reminder to the gods that the pharaoh had lived a life worthy of entering their world. But if the soul was found wanting, if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, no pyramid, no treasure, could save it. The tombs were not just for the dead. They were for the living too. Each pyramid was a symbol of continuity, a promise that the king would watch over his people from the afterlife. They were a way for the living to keep a connection with their loved ones, a way to honor those who had gone before them. The tombs were places of pilgrimage, where people could go to pray, to offer gifts, and to ask for the protection and blessings of the deceased. The tombs became part of the landscape, part of the fabric of life in Egypt. And in this way, the pharaoh's tombs became a living monument, reminding everyone that death was not an end but a transformation, a passage to something greater. As the last stone was set in place, sealing the tomb forever, the people would step back, their hearts heavy with loss but full of hope. The pyramid stood tall against the horizon, a testament to the king's legacy, to the divine journey that awaited him. It was a symbol of the soul's journey from life to death, from mortality to eternity, and it was there that the pharaoh would rest, waiting for the day when his soul would rise again to join the gods. The tombs of the pharaohs were not just monuments to their greatness, they were gateways to the divine, where the soul would pass from one world to the next, forever carried by the love and devotion of those left behind. The scent of incense lingers in the still air. A soft murmur of prayers drifts through the household as family members gather around a small, carefully arranged altar. It is not a place for mourning, but for honoring. On the table before them lie offerings, fruits, bread, and perhaps a favorite dish of the departed. There, in the flickering candlelight, they place a small offering of water, just as they did yesterday, and the day before, and every day before that. They do it with a quiet reverence, knowing that each gift, however small, is an act of love. This is the way it has always been. The bond between the living and the dead is not broken. It stretches across the boundary of life and death, fragile yet unyielding. For in Egypt, death was not an end. It was simply another journey, a journey that continued long after the body had been laid to rest. The offerings placed before the dead were not mere symbols. They were necessities. The deceased still needed food, drink, and even companionship. In the afterlife, just as in life, they were believed to need sustenance to survive. The living did not simply mourn their lost ones, they ensured they were cared for. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every fresh fruit placed on the altar was a small act of devotion, a way to remind the dead that they were not forgotten. They were loved, and the family would provide for them, just as they had when they were alive. But it was not just food that was offered. The dead were offered gifts for the journey they had already begun. Clothing, jewelry, and even statues were placed beside their tombs. These objects were meant to provide comfort and protection, to ensure the soul's safe passage through the unknown realms. The family, through these offerings, was seen as continuing their care, just as they would for a living relative. It was a bond, one that stretched beyond the grave, holding firm through the rituals and prayers. It wasn't just once a year or on special occasions that offerings were made. It was an everyday act. Every day, the family would gather in quiet reflection, making sure the soul of the departed had what it needed. The household carried on as usual, children played, adults worked, but always in the background was the gentle ritual of remembrance. It was as natural as breathing. The deceased weren't truly gone. They lived on, in spirit, in the quiet corners of the home, and in the hearts of those who continued to care for them. The rituals were simple, but their meaning was profound. Each offering was a reminder of the family's love. Each word spoken in prayer was a reaffirmation of the bond that could not be severed. The living did not just perform rituals, they invited the deceased to remain with them, not in body, but in presence. The connection was tangible, felt in the hushed tones of a prayer, the careful placement of food, and the lighting of a candle in the evening. These moments became sacred. And as they knelt before the altar, they could almost feel the warmth of the departed spirit lingering, watching over them, guiding them through life. But it wasn't just the family's duty to provide. The living believed that the deceased, in turn, had a role to play in the lives of those still walking the earth. The souls of the departed were seen as protectors, guardians of the family. They were there, always, even if unseen. And so, just as the living offered daily support, they also called upon the deceased for help. In times of difficulty, in moments of sorrow, the family would whisper the name of the departed, asking for guidance or protection. It was a silent agreement, life would go on, but it would always be touched by the presence of the dead. In return for the offerings, the family sought blessings, hoping their loved ones would watch over them from the realm beyond. The bond between the living and the dead wasn't just one-sided. The deceased were believed to help, just as the living helped them. It was a shared responsibility. The afterlife wasn't a lonely existence, not in the Egyptian understanding. The soul, though separated by death, was never truly cut off from the world it left behind. It had purpose. It had meaning. And through these rituals, the departed continued to participate in the world of the living, not as memories, but as active, present forces. They were honored and remembered, yes, but they also offered guidance, protection, and the occasional whisper of wisdom. Each day, each offering, was a reminder that death did not separate. It only transformed. The living continued their work, their lives, with the understanding that their loved ones, those they had lost, still walked beside them, if only in spirit. The altar, the offerings, the prayers, they were the bridge. And every time the family sat down to offer their respect, to give their love, they were reaffirming that the soul's journey was not one that ended with the tomb. No, it continued, every day, through the little things, the food, the prayers, the light that flickered on the altar in the stillness of the night. The offering of bread might seem like a small thing. But in that simple act, a profound truth is revealed. Love doesn't stop at death. It reaches beyond the grave, across the veil, through time, in the rituals of remembrance. The offering is a promise, you are still with us, and we will continue to care for you. And so, every day, in every home, in every quiet prayer, in every offering made, the departed are remembered. They live on. They remain part of the family. The rituals are a testament to love, to honor, and to the unbroken bond between the living and the dead. This cycle continues, and in each small act of devotion, the soul's journey is sustained. Every offering is a story of connection, of remembrance, of love that stretches beyond life, beyond death, into eternity. Through this sacred practice, the living give meaning to the dead, and in doing so, the dead give meaning to the living. And in this endless exchange, love endures. The walls are still, but the images on them come alive. The flickering candlelight dances across the frescoes, casting shadows that seem to move, following the journey of the soul. As you step closer, the figures painted in vibrant colors appear to gaze back, their eyes filled with a quiet power and eternal purpose. They are not mere pictures, they are guides, protectors, guardians of the soul as it begins its voyage into the afterlife. In ancient Egypt, art was not simply for beauty, it had a far more sacred role. The frescoes, the statues, the carvings, they were not just decorations for the tomb, but tools to ensure the deceased would find their way. The afterlife was a dangerous, unpredictable place, and the art created by the living served as a map, a beacon of light to guide the soul through the darkness. A fresco on the tomb wall could show the deceased standing before Osiris, the god of the afterlife, offering their heart in exchange for judgment. The painted scene wasn't just for show, it was a prayer, a plea for safety, for favor. The art was a conversation between the living and the dead, a silent yet powerful interaction. Each brushstroke was a hope, a belief that the soul would be guided by these images through the treacherous paths of the do-it. It wasn't just the images on the walls that carried meaning, but the very figures themselves. Statues of the deceased, often placed at the entrance of tombs or near the burial site, stood as silent sentinels. Their presence was a reminder that death was not the end. The statues were more than just representations, they were the deceased in form, their spirits dwelling in these figures to ensure their journey continued, even after the body had turned to dust. The statues served as a bridge between the worlds of the living and the dead, offering comfort and guidance when the soul was lost, when it wandered aimlessly in the afterlife. Each figure had a purpose, each form held a specific meaning. A statue of a seated scribe would ensure that the deceased would continue to write in the afterlife, their work never interrupted. A statue of a priest, his hands raised in prayer, would provide protection, calling upon the gods to defend the soul against evil forces. These images were not idle, they were powerful symbols of life continuing beyond death, a promise that the deceased would never be forgotten, that they would be cared for and protected. But art was not just a form of protection, it was also a guide. On the tomb walls, you could see the deceased sailing on a boat, traveling across the celestial waters of the afterlife. These boats weren't just images of a serene journey, they were blueprints, maps that showed the path the soul would take. The boat carried the spirit of the deceased across the night sky, to the place where the sun was reborn, a journey that was both literal and symbolic. The soul had to travel these waters, pass through dangers and trials, and emerge victorious, transformed. The frescoes didn't just depict the soul's journey, they also showed the gods that would help or hinder the spirit along the way. The god Anubis, with his jackal head, would guide the soul to the scales of Maat, where the heart would be weighed against a feather to determine its worthiness. If the heart was light, the soul would be granted eternal life. If heavy, it would be devoured by the demon Ammit. These scenes were painted in meticulous detail, not to show the gods as distant figures, but as active participants in the soul's journey. They were not to be feared, but respected. They were protectors, and their images on the walls served as a reminder that the soul was never truly alone. There was a sacredness in every brushstroke, every carving, every statue placed in the tomb. Art was the living language of the dead. The frescoes weren't just pictures, they were prayers that could be spoken without words. Every color, every figure, was carefully chosen to offer the soul the best possible chance at reaching the afterlife's most sacred realms. And the deceased, as they passed through the shadowy world of the Duat, would feel the warmth of these images guiding them, helping them navigate through the dark. The role of funerary art didn't end when the tomb was sealed. The art stayed behind, a lasting imprint that ensured the soul's protection. The murals that adorned the tombs were not just for decoration, they were like whispers in the dark, offering reassurance and hope. The living believed that as long as these images remained, the deceased would continue to live, at least in spirit. These images spoke of love, devotion, and duty, making it clear that the afterlife wasn't a solitary journey, it was one that was watched over, cared for, and helped along by the family and the gods. And when the family visited the tomb, they weren't just honoring the dead, they were connecting with them. The deceased, and their statues and their paintings, were still part of the family. They hadn't left, they had simply moved into a different world. And with each offering, with each prayer, they were invited back into the lives of their loved ones, the journey continuing as the soul moved through the afterlife, guided by the art that had been left behind. As the years passed and the tombs fell into ruin, the art remained. It may have been worn by time, faded by the relentless touch of the sun and sand, but its power never diminished. Even in the silence of the tombs, in the desolate stretches of the desert, the art spoke. It was a story, a legacy. The frescoes may have been painted centuries ago, but the messages they held were eternal. They would never cease to guide, to protect, to remind the soul that no matter what, it would always find its way home. The mournful cry of a cat echoes through the stillness of the tomb. It's not a living cat, but one of the sacred creatures of Egypt, its mummified body carefully placed in a small, decorated sarcophagus. The air is thick with reverence as the delicate figure, once so full of life, now lies in eternal sleep. It is hard to fathom, but in the eyes of the Egyptians, even animals had a place in the afterlife. They were not mere companions for the living, they were sacred beings with their own journey to make. In the land of the pharaohs, animals weren't just pets or symbols. They were honored, loved, and, in death, ensured a place among the gods. Dogs, cats, falcons, and even bulls, each species had its own role to play in the divine world. Their lives, whether spent in service, companionship, or worship, continued even after death. Their journey into the afterlife was as sacred as that of their human counterparts. The tombs of these animals weren't just places of burial. They were sanctuaries. Every detail of their final resting places was carefully designed with their journey in mind. The cat, for example, might be surrounded by intricate carvings of the goddess Batet, protector of home and hearth. The dog, loyal and brave, would be honored with depictions of Anubis, the god of embalming, who would lead the spirit of the animal through the afterlife. These animals were not forgotten, their spirits were called upon, their bodies treated with the same respect as that of any pharaoh or noble. For in the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, animals, too, were deserving of the eternal protection and guidance of the gods. The journey of these sacred animals was not a solitary one. They followed paths carved into the hearts of those who had loved them. A cat was not simply left behind, it was cherished for its grace, its independence, and its deep connection with the divine. Cats were seen as earthly manifestations of the goddess Batet, a fierce protector and goddess of love, music, and joy. When a cat died, its body would be carefully mummified, as though it was being sent off to join the great goddess in the heavens, to bask in her presence for eternity. The care with which the cat's body was preserved spoke volumes about the Egyptians' reverence for these creatures, a respect that transcended the boundaries between the living and the dead. But it wasn't just cats who had a sacred role. The falcon, with its soaring wings and sharp eyes, was the embodiment of Horus, the sky god, who watched over both the living and the dead. Falcons were mummified and placed in tombs, their spirits guided by the god Horus himself. Their flight across the skies didn't end with death. Instead, they were given wings to carry them on an eternal journey across the heavens, alongside the gods. The mummified body of a falcon was not just a token of love, but a testament to the belief that even the most majestic of creatures had a place among the divine, soaring high in the afterlife, their souls never to be forgotten. Then there were the dogs, symbols of loyalty, protection, and companionship. Dogs were often buried with their owners, ensuring that they would remain by their side even in death. These animals were believed to accompany their masters through the afterlife, offering protection from the dangers that lurked in the shadowy world beyond. It was said that the spirits of dogs were like guardians, guiding their human companions through the trials and tribulations of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Their loyalty did not end at death. It became an eternal bond, a connection that could never be broken, even by the greatest of forces. But there were also the larger, more imposing creatures, cows and bulls, whose strength and power were revered as a symbol of fertility and creation. They, too, were carefully prepared for the afterlife, their bodies mummified with the same reverence as any royal figure. Cows were often associated with Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and motherhood, and bulls were linked to Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis, worshipped as a living god. Their journey through the afterlife was one of power, strength, and divine connection. In death, they became immortal, their spirits never to be lost. The journey of these animals wasn't just about what happened in the afterlife, but also how their death was handled on earth. The funerary rites for animals were elaborate and deliberate. The Egyptians believed that in mummifying the animals, they were not just preserving the body for eternity, but also sending them off with all the necessary provisions for their journey. Food offerings, amulets, and charms were placed in the tombs to ensure the animals would have everything they needed in the afterlife. The mummified animals were treated with the same care as the mummified humans, wrapped in fine linen, placed in sarcophagi, and buried with the belief that they would continue to serve their purpose beyond death. What's most remarkable is the sheer devotion to these animals. They were not considered mere creatures, they were part of the divine order. Their spirits were thought to be eternal, their journeys no less important than those of humans. When these animals were mummified, they were entrusted with a duty far greater than simply being a companion. They were seen as an integral part of the divine balance, guiding their souls into eternity, ensuring that no one, human or animal, would be lost. As the mummified bodies of these sacred animals lie in tombs, beneath the shadow of the pyramids and the great temples, their spirits are free. They soar across the sky, walk beside their human companions, and take their place among the gods. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an end, but a continuation. And for the sacred animals, this journey was one of devotion, loyalty, and love, a journey that would never cease, a bond that could never be broken. In the afterlife, the souls of the animals would find peace, their spirits forever woven into the fabric of the divine. They were never forgotten, never abandoned, and their legacy would live on, as eternal as the stars. The air hums with the ancient whispers of Egypt, a land where symbols are not just images but living expressions of eternal truth. You can almost hear the soft murmur of the past calling to you as the wind stirs the sands, revealing fragments of a time long gone. Among the most powerful of these whispers are the symbols that carry the promise of life beyond death, the keys to resurrection, and the endless journey into the afterlife. They are simple, yet profound, the jet pillar, the ankh, and the scarab. Each one, in its quiet majesty, holds a piece of a truth so powerful that it has survived millennia. The jade pillar stands tall, an ancient representation of stability, strength, and the spine. Imagine standing before it, feeling the weight of its meaning pressed down upon you like the very foundations of the earth. The jade is not just a pillar, it is the spine of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. This symbol is a direct connection to the promise of resurrection. When a soul's body is buried, the jade serves as a reminder that even in death, there is stability, there is the strength to rise again. The jade pillar is not just a representation of physical strength, but of spiritual resilience. It tells the soul that no matter how long the journey, no matter how deep the darkness, there is always a way to rise again, to stand tall once more. This is the promise made to those who believe that death is not the end, but a transition, a passage into something greater. Then there is the Ankh, the most recognizable symbol of life itself. At first glance, it may seem simple, a cross with a loop at the top, but its meaning is as deep and profound as the Nile River that nourished the land. The Ankh is the symbol of eternal life. It is not merely a symbol of the physical act of living, but of life that continues, endlessly, beyond death. Hold the Ankh in your hand, and it is as if you hold the very essence of existence. It represents the breath of life, given by the gods to all creatures, and the unyielding pulse that continues after death. In ancient Egypt, the Ankh was placed in the hands of the deceased to carry with them into the afterlife, ensuring that they would never truly die. It is a promise of rebirth, a hope that life, like the sun, will rise again each day. It speaks to the deep yearning within every heart, to live forever, to never truly be gone. When worn as jewelry, the Ankh became a talisman, a constant reminder of the divine protection that would guide one through the darkness, into the light of eternal life. Then, there is the scarab, small, yet powerful, rolling its ball of dung across the earth. It symbolizes the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The scarab is not just an insect, it is the embodiment of the sun god, Khepri, who rolls the sun across the sky each day. The scarab's journey from a humble beetle into a powerful symbol of regeneration mirrors the process of transformation that every soul undergoes. In the Egyptian world, the scarab is more than just a creature, it is a symbol of resurrection itself. When the scarab rolls its ball into the tomb, it signifies the returning of life, the promise that nothing truly ends. As the sun sets and the darkness of night falls, the scarab rises, rolling the sun into a new day. The soul of the deceased, symbolized by the scarab, is given the same opportunity to rise again, to be reborn, to journey through eternity. The scarab was often placed with the dead, sometimes under the tongue or on the heart, as a way to ensure that they would be reborn, just as the scarab rolls its ball over the earth, returning again and again. These symbols, the jade, the Ankh, and the scarab, are not just representations of concepts, they are living entities in themselves. They carry with them the weight of 1,000 hopes, 1,000 prayers, and 1,000 lives. The jade, with its promise of strength and stability, assures the soul that no matter how far it has fallen, it can rise again. The Ankh, with its eternal loop, whispers that life, though it may seem fleeting, is forever, an unbroken cycle. And the scarab, rolling tirelessly on, reminds us that death is not the end, but the beginning of a new cycle, one that continues for eternity. In the tombs, the walls were adorned with these symbols, the air thick with their power. Each symbol etched into stone, each amulet placed with care, each prayer offered up, was meant to guide the soul on its journey. They were the beacons that would light the way through the darkness of the afterlife, the gentle touch of a hand reaching out to help the soul rise again, again, and again. As you stand before these symbols, you are struck by their simplicity, their elegance, and the profound truth they convey. They are not just shapes or drawings, they are promises. The jade offers stability and strength in the face of death. The Ankh offers eternal life, an endless pulse that never fades. The scarab offers rebirth, the promise that no matter how dark the night, the sun will rise again. These symbols speak to the heart of what it means to live and die in Egypt, to understand that death is not the end, but a transition, a part of the grand cycle that continues forever. They are reminders that no matter how small or fragile we may feel, we are part of something much larger. The jade, the Ankh, and the scarab are not just for the dead, they are for the living, too. They are symbols of hope, of strength, and of the eternal nature of life itself. Even in the darkest times, they shine, lighting the path toward eternity, reminding us that death, like life, is only a step in the journey. Eternity is a promise whispered in the rustling of the Nile's waters, in the dust that shifts with the desert winds, and in the silent prayers carved into stone. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an end, but a doorway. They saw life as a vast, unbroken cycle, a continuous flow that carried the soul through both darkness and light, forever. For them, the soul was not just a fleeting thing, it was eternal, stretching beyond the reaches of the earth and into realms unknown, where the journey never truly ended. The concept of eternity, for the Egyptians, was not a far-off dream or a distant hope, it was something tangible, something they could touch with their hearts and minds. It was something they could see reflected in the rising and setting of the sun, in the rhythmic pattern of the seasons, and in the very fabric of existence itself. Life and death were not separate events, but two parts of a never-ending cycle. When the sun sank below the horizon each night, the Egyptians knew it was not lost, but merely traveling through the darkness to be reborn. In the same way, their souls would traverse through the shadowy realm of the afterlife to be reborn into a new existence. It was this cyclical nature of life and death that defined their understanding of eternity. The soul, to the Egyptians, was a thing of light, energy, and spirit, an essence that could never be destroyed. It lived on in the cycles of nature, in the stars above, and in the hearts of those who remembered it. When a person died, their body was not simply discarded, but carefully preserved, as a vessel to help their soul move on to the next stage of its journey. The body was important, yes, but the soul was the true essence of life, eternal and unbreakable. They believed that the soul, through the proper rituals, would continue to live forever, passing from one realm to the next, just as the stars remained fixed in the sky, unchanged for eternity. In the afterlife, the soul was not alone. The gods, with their eternal wisdom, were always there to guide and protect. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, ruled over the dead, ensuring that those who had passed would find peace in the next world. But the soul's journey was not a simple one. It was fraught with challenges, trials, and tests. The soul would face judgment, where its deeds and life would be weighed against a feather, the symbol of truth and justice. It was a daunting moment, one that would determine whether the soul could continue its path toward eternal life or be lost forever in the darkness of oblivion. But even in that moment of judgment, the Egyptians believed that the soul's connection to eternity could not be broken. If it was found worthy, the soul would move on to the field of reeds, a paradise where it could live in peace forever, alongside the gods and ancestors. But what of those who failed? What happened to their souls? In the Egyptians' eyes, even death could not erase the chance for rebirth. There was always hope that through offerings, prayers, and the proper rituals, a soul could be guided back onto the path of eternity. This belief in cyclical renewal, where even in failure there was a chance for transformation, was at the heart of their view of existence. They saw life as an ongoing process, a continuous journey that carried the soul through different stages of being. The soul could always be renewed, just as the sun rose again after each night. The eternal nature of the soul was not limited to just humans. The animals, too, shared in this promise of rebirth. The Egyptians saw the creatures of the earth as sacred beings, each playing a role in the eternal cycle of life. The cat, revered as the guardian of the home and protector of the living, was believed to accompany its owner into the afterlife, ensuring that the soul's journey was safe. Even the humble scarab, rolling its ball of dung, was seen as a symbol of resurrection and renewal, embodying the idea that life could always start again, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. Just as the scarab emerged from its tiny cocoon into the light, so too could the soul emerge from the darkness of death into the light of eternal life. This belief in the cyclical nature of life also extended to the earth itself. The Nile River, which flooded each year and brought fertility to the land, was seen as a symbol of this constant renewal. Just as the river's waters receded and returned, so too did life itself, endlessly flowing, never truly stopping. The Egyptians understood that death was simply another stage in this grand cycle, a temporary resting place before the soul would once again rise and begin anew. It is in this unbroken flow, this eternal cycle, that the concept of eternity comes to life. The soul, whether human or animal, could not be contained by death. It would rise again, just as the sun would rise each day, just as the seasons would turn, and the stars would cross the sky. The Egyptians understood that the soul's journey was not linear, it was not defined by the limits of life and death. It was a journey that moved through endless time, a path that twisted and turned, but ultimately led to the same destination, eternity. When you stand before the towering pyramids, the grand tombs, and the stone carvings that cover the walls, you can almost hear the whispers of those who believed so deeply in this eternal cycle. The words of their prayers, the rituals they performed, and the offerings they made were all meant to ensure that their souls, and the souls of their loved ones, would continue to journey forever, rising again with the sun, reborn, renewed, eternal. It is this understanding of eternity that shapes the very essence of ancient Egyptian thought. Life and death are not two separate, opposing forces. They are intertwined, part of a greater whole, a cycle that continues on forever, beyond time and space. In their hearts, the Egyptians believed that nothing, not even death, could break the bond of eternity. The soul, pure and unchanging, would travel forever through the afterlife, carried on the wings of the gods, through the darkness and into the light. Forever. The air in ancient Egypt was thick with the scent of incense, the murmur of prayers, and the weight of belief. A great river of souls flowed from the world of the living to the world of the dead, each person's journey shaped by their station in life. In the land of pharaohs and pyramids, death was not simply a departure from the physical world, it was a passage to something far greater. But how you prepared for that journey, where you would go, and what you would become in the afterlife depended on who you were in life. For the rich, the powerful, and the blessed, the afterlife was a realm of luxury, vast and endless, filled with the gods. For those less fortunate, the road was a harder one, where hope was the only offering they could afford. The rich, who lived lives bathed in wealth and privilege, had the luxury of preparing for the afterlife in grand ways. They spent their lives gathering possessions, hoping to carry them into the next world. They were surrounded by servants, fine clothes, and endless treasures. When death came, their preparations were grand, elaborate tombs, intricate mummification, and precious goods to accompany them on their journey. To the Egyptians, the tomb was more than a final resting place, it was a gateway to eternity. And for those who had the means, it was a spectacular one. Pharaohs, the gods' living representatives, had tombs that would defy time. Their pyramids loomed like monuments to immortality, designed to ensure that their passage into the afterlife would be as glorious as their reign on earth. The rich, buried in tombs lined with treasures, had priests, sacred rituals, and tomb paintings meant to guide them through the afterlife's trials. These individuals, pampered in life, believed their souls would pass through dark realms, face judgment, and rise again in paradise. They would join Osiris in the eternal realm of the blessed, sitting among the gods, their bodies preserved forever in a state of divine repose. The thought of eternity in such splendor was a powerful one, and they were willing to do anything to ensure that it was their reality. Every prayer, every offering, and every golden object placed in their tomb was a step closer to that bright, golden world beyond the grave. But for the common people, the story of the afterlife was not so grand. They too believed in the promise of life after death, but their means of preparing were more humble. Their tombs were smaller, their offerings fewer, and their mummification simpler. But that did not mean their hopes were any less. For them, the afterlife was not a place of luxury, but a place of peace, a reunion with loved ones, and an eternal existence in the company of their gods. They did not seek palaces in the next life, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that their souls would be safe, forever remembered by their families and ancestors. Their journey would still take them through darkness, but they believed that with enough faith, they too would rise again in the field of reeds, the ancient paradise where the soul could rest in peace. Yet even for the common folk, there were rituals to be followed, prayers to be spoken, and offerings to be made. They would place small statues and amulets in their tombs, hoping to protect their souls on their journey. They relied on the gods, trusting that their guidance would lead them through the dangers of the afterlife. But the rituals, while vital, were often less elaborate than those for the wealthy. Still, the belief in the continuity of life, the hope of finding peace in the afterlife, united all Egyptians, no matter their class. The soul was equal in the eyes of the gods, and everyone, rich or poor, had the right to claim their place in eternity. The difference in the preparations reflected the different ways Egyptians saw themselves in the grand scheme of things. The wealthy, in their elaborate tombs and treasures, saw themselves as closer to the gods, believing their status in life would ensure them an easier passage into the afterlife. The common people, while not blessed with riches, had their own kind of faith. Their preparations were less lavish, but their hopes were just as real. They sought solace in the knowledge that the gods were not bound by social hierarchies. In the afterlife, all were equal. As the years passed, and Egypt's dynasties rose and fell, the gap between the rich and the poor in the afterlife remained. The wealthy left behind monuments to their greatness, while the poor left behind their simplest offerings, prayers, small statues, and the hope that their families would remember them. It was a world of contradictions, where the afterlife could be both the ultimate reward and the great equalizer. Death, for all its finality, was also a promise that the soul would transcend its earthly bonds and live forever in the light of the gods. But no matter who you were, no matter how you lived or what you had, there was one thing that all Egyptians shared: the hope that their souls would be cared for, protected, and preserved. Whether through vast wealth or humble offerings, they all sought the same thing: peace. The rituals of the afterlife were not just for the rich, they were for everyone. And in the end, no matter the tomb, no matter the offerings, the journey was the same: the soul's passage through darkness, seeking the light of eternity. In the quiet of the tombs, beneath the stone and the gold, the voices of the living echoed. The prayers of the living for the dead were endless, their hopes unshaken by time. It didn't matter if you were a pharaoh or a farmer, death was a passage, and it was always accompanied by the same promise: eternity. The heavy scent of incense fills the air, the flames flickering as the prayers of the living rise to the heavens. To the Egyptians, the afterlife was not a distant place, it was the next step, a journey to a life beyond the one they knew. But as the gods whispered to them through their sacred texts and rituals, what awaited them after death was more than a continuation, it was a transformation, a chance to live forever in a paradise. The heart and soul of the Egyptian afterlife lay in the hope of renewal, of being reborn like the sun itself. Their vision of eternity was one of rebirth, cycles of life, death, and resurrection. But what of the other ancient cultures? What did they believe, and how did their views of the afterlife shape their lives? As the Egyptians meticulously prepared their tombs, filled with treasures and prayers, they could not have known how differently the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, and others would view death and the world beyond. In Mesopotamia, where the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates shaped the very foundation of life, death was not so much a passage to a renewed life as it was a descent into darkness. The Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians had a vision of the afterlife that was a stark contrast to the Egyptians. For them, death meant a journey into the underworld, a place where the soul wandered in silence and shadows, far from the warmth and sunlight of the living. There was no resurrection waiting for them, no field of reeds, no lush, eternal paradise. The dead lived in a dark, dreary realm, cut off from the light, where even the gods rarely ventured. The Mesopotamians feared the afterlife not as a promise of eternal life, but as an inevitable end to everything they had once known. The stark differences between the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians lay in the idea of the soul's fate. While the Egyptians held the belief that the soul could find peace, live on in paradise, and be judged by Osiris for its deeds, the Mesopotamians saw the soul's fate as grim, bound to wander in silence. The Mesopotamians' afterlife was not one of judgment and transformation, but a place of suffering, a cold realm where they were left to face eternity without the love and care of the gods. Yet, even as the Egyptians prepared to pass through the afterlife with hope, the Greeks, who would later rise in power, saw death as a passage to something equally mysterious, but far different from the Egyptians' vision. In Greek thought, the afterlife was governed by the gods of the underworld, Hades and Persephone. For the Greeks, the dead passed into an underworld that was not just dark and bleak, but one filled with varied realms. Some souls were taken to the asphodel meadows, a place where they would linger in a dull, half-forgotten existence. Others, if they were especially virtuous, might find themselves in the Elysian fields, a paradise, yes, but a more exclusive one than the one that the Egyptians hoped to join. In Greek mythology, the afterlife was deeply connected to the nature of the soul. Were they heroic or evil in life? Were they remembered for greatness or condemned to wander in misery? The Egyptians, with their unwavering belief in resurrection, looked to the sun for guidance, believing that as the sun rose each day, so too could their souls rise again. Their tombs, carefully prepared with offerings and sacred texts, were meant to protect their souls and guide them to eternal life. This was something entirely different from the Greek view, where the dead might be forgotten or cut off from their humanity, especially if they lived less than virtuous lives. Across the world, in the land of the mighty Persians, the afterlife took on yet another shape. The Persians believed in a cosmic struggle between light and dark, good and evil, embodied in the spirits of Ahura Mazda and Ingra. The soul's fate rested on the choices made in life, but unlike the Egyptians, who focused on judgment in the afterlife, the Persians believed in a final battle between good and evil that would determine the ultimate fate of the soul. There was no definitive paradise or eternal peace. Instead, the soul could be purified through its choices, eventually entering a divine realm or facing torment. And then, there were the Celts, whose beliefs in the afterlife were shaped by the ancient traditions of nature and the spirits of the earth. They held a belief in the otherworld, a realm beyond death, where the souls of the dead lived on in harmony with nature. But the Celts' afterlife was not just a single destination. It was a cyclical journey, deeply connected to the changing of the seasons, life, and death, like the leaves of the trees, which would fall and rise again with the dawn of each new season. Death was not an end, but a continuation, a transformation into something new. While the Egyptians envisioned eternity through the rebirth of the sun, the Celts saw eternity as the endless cycle of the natural world, where the soul would always return, again and again, to the land of the living. Even in the distant lands of China, the afterlife was approached with reverence, but in their own distinct way. The ancient Chinese believed in the importance of honoring the spirits of their ancestors. The afterlife was not a journey of personal transformation like the Egyptian view, but one of continued connection with the living. The dead were believed to live in the Yellow Springs, a realm where they could receive offerings from their descendants. The Egyptians may have prepared elaborate tombs with treasures, but the Chinese relied on families to honor their dead and ensure their spirits were sustained in the next world. In each culture, the afterlife was not simply a place. It was a reflection of the values and hopes of the people who believed in it. For the Egyptians, it was a place of renewal, of resurrection, and eternal life. For the Greeks, it was a place of finality, with an uncertain fate for each soul. The Mesopotamians, with their quiet resignation, saw death as an end, their spirits cast into darkness. The Persians believed in a cosmic struggle, while the Celts saw life and death as cyclical, part of the endless dance of nature. The differences were striking, but at the core of each belief was a universal longing, a desire for peace, for continuity, for immortality in some form. The afterlife was not just a destination, it was a reflection of what each culture valued most in life. Whether it was the Egyptians' vision of resurrection, the Greeks' pursuit of virtue, or the Mesopotamians' somber acceptance, every culture reached for something beyond the grave. A hope that, in the end, death would not be the end. The sunlight pours over the landscape, and as the shadows lengthen, the world shifts. There, in the quiet of the evening, the ancient rituals of the past seem to echo through time. The Egyptians, with their unshakable belief in the afterlife, set into motion a legacy that stretches far beyond their time, one that continues to ripple through the fabric of our world today. It is as if the very essence of their spiritual vision refuses to fade, lingering in our dreams, thoughts, and practices, leaving behind a subtle, yet powerful influence. Their belief in an eternal existence, a soul that could transcend death, lives on in us. In their eyes, death was never an end but a doorway, a passage to something far greater. And that idea of immortality, the notion that our souls continue on, still holds sway over us. In every prayer, in every ritual, in every belief about what happens after death, there is a whisper from ancient Egypt, telling us that life is not merely about living, it's about becoming something more, something eternal. When we light candles in remembrance, when we offer prayers for loved ones who have passed, we are not so different from the Egyptians who filled their tombs with light and offerings. In their belief, the journey to the afterlife was not a solitary one. The deceased were aided by the living, carried by the prayers, the rituals, and the love that transcended the boundaries of life. We, too, continue to honor those who have left us, lighting a candle, sending our thoughts into the air, and hoping that in some way, our words reach them. The rituals may have changed over the millennia, but the heart of the practice, the belief that the deceased are not forgotten, that they are not lost, is the same. And it's not just in death that the legacy of the Egyptian afterlife lives on. Their profound respect for the soul, for the journey of the spirit, speaks to our deepest, most human need for purpose. The Egyptians believed that each life was a thread in a greater tapestry, that every soul had a role to play, not just in this life, but in eternity. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth was woven into the very fabric of their existence. And today, so many of us still feel that pull, that deep desire to know that our lives have meaning beyond the moments we can see and touch. How often do we seek out spiritual practices to guide us? Whether through meditation, yoga, or rituals passed down through generations, the search for connection to something greater than ourselves echoes the Egyptian belief in the continued journey of the soul. The idea of being part of something larger than our own fleeting existence resonates deeply with us. The ancient Egyptians' vision of the afterlife as a place of renewal, transformation, and light is mirrored in the modern spiritual practices that seek the same. Just as the Egyptians envisioned the soul navigating the challenges of the afterlife, so too do we strive for inner peace, enlightenment, and a connection to something eternal. It is in that quest for spiritual ascension, for enlightenment and balance, that their teachings still live, urging us to seek a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world beyond. The pyramid, once a monument to kings and gods, now stands as a symbol of that yearning for ascension, for the soul to rise above the mundane and into something sacred. It's a symbol that we carry with us in our personal quests for meaning and understanding. Whether it's the search for inner truth, enlightenment, or connection with the divine, the pyramid continues to stand as a reminder of our journey towards something higher, something eternal. And it's not just a physical structure that has endured, it is the very idea behind it, the belief that the soul can ascend, that we can reach for something beyond the ordinary, that has permeated the way we view spirituality today. In the teachings of reincarnation, a concept that has its roots in ancient cultures like Egypt, there is the belief that the soul is never truly gone, that it returns again and again, learning and evolving with each new life. The Egyptians believed that the soul, after passing through death, could be reborn, purified, and renewed. That vision of eternal renewal, of life after life, is not so different from the teachings many hold dear today. Just as they believed the sun rose each day as a symbol of hope, we, too, hold onto the idea of renewal. The eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth is as much a part of our modern understanding of existence as it was to the Egyptians. Even in the more personal spiritual practices, there is a nod to the Egyptian idea of the soul's journey. When we seek to rid ourselves of past pain, to cleanse ourselves of past mistakes, we are echoing the Egyptian belief in the purification of the soul. Their rituals, full of prayers, spells, and offerings, were ways to ensure that the soul made it safely through the afterlife, purified and whole. Today, through rituals of healing, of letting go, we still strive to cleanse our souls, to become whole again, to prepare ourselves for whatever comes next. Whether through prayer, affirmations, or even therapy, we seek to purify and restore, to walk through life free of the burdens we carry. There is also the continuing impact of the Egyptian gods themselves, the deities of life, death, and rebirth. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and Anubis, the god of mummification and the protector of the dead, continue to inspire spiritual practices centered around death and rebirth. Osiris, who was brought back to life after his death, is a figure that echoes in the hearts of those who seek resurrection, healing, and renewal in their own lives. His story is not just a tale of ancient belief, but a universal story of hope, of rising from the darkness, and of finding life again in the face of death. The influence of Egyptian spirituality is woven into our own spiritual practices, no matter how they might differ in form. In every prayer whispered for the dead, in every ritual of cleansing and renewal, in every belief in the eternal nature of the soul, there is a part of Egypt's legacy that refuses to fade. It is a legacy that speaks of the eternal, the enduring, and the divine. It speaks of life after death, of the soul's journey, and of the power of love and remembrance that transcends the boundaries of time.